Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The rental listing had been too good to be true. A colonial house in the heart of Cartagena's old quarter for half the price of comparable properties. I should have known better, but skepticism has always been my armor against the world's endless capacity for deception. Ghost stories, spiritual cleansings, the locals' whispered warnings about certain addresses, all of it struck me as elaborate theater designed to separate tourists from their money. The house sat on a narrow cobblestone street, where the afternoon shadows stretched long and dark between buildings that had witnessed 4 centuries of human struggle. Its walls were thick limestone, painted in that particular shade of colonial yellow that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The real estate agent, a nervous woman who kept glancing at her watch, had hurried through the walkthrough with practiced efficiency, her heels clicking against the ceramic tiles that covered every surface like a geometric skin. Those tiles would become my obsession. The first week passed without incident. I worked from the small study overlooking the interior courtyard, where a dry fountain sat surrounded by untended plants that rustled without wind. The house settled around me with the groans and sighs of old wood and older stones, sounds I attributed to thermal expansion and the weight of accumulated years. My laptop screen provided the only modern light in rooms where electric bulbs seemed to cast shadows more than illumination. I had rented the place for 3 months, long enough to complete the research project that had brought me to Colombia. Academic work on colonial trade routes, dry, methodical stuff that required no belief in anything beyond documented facts and economic patterns. The irony wasn't lost on me later. It was on the 8th day, at exactly 3 in the afternoon, that everything changed. I had been reviewing shipping manifests from the 1700s when the temperature in the study dropped so suddenly that my breath became visible. Not just cool, the kind of cold that reaches into your bones and makes your teeth ache. But here's what defied explanation. The cold didn't fill the room, it followed me. When I stood and moved toward the window, the sphere of frigid air moved with me, as if I carried winter in my clothes. That's when I saw him. A figure walked across the main room, visible through the study's open doorway. Tall, wearing what looked like period clothing, a dark coat that might have been fashionable 3 centuries ago. He moved with purpose, crossing from the front entrance toward the kitchen in a straight line, never looking in my direction. His footsteps made no sound on the ceramic tiles, but I could see each one as a brief distortion in the air, like heat waves in reverse. The cold followed his path. I called out, not a greeting, but that wordless sound people make when they're startled. The figure didn't pause or turn. He simply continued his trajectory until he passed beyond my line of sight, and then the temperature returned to normal so abruptly that I wondered if I had imagined the entire episode, except for what I discovered next. Curiosity overrode caution, and I followed the route the figure had taken. Each tile where he had stepped was cracked, not shattered or broken, but marked with hairline fractures that formed patterns I recognized from my research, colonial symbols used to mark property boundaries and trade agreements. A stylized compass rose, a merchant's seal, what looked like a simplified map of the Caribbean islands. I knelt and traced the cracks with my fingertip. They were real, cold to the touch, and definitely fresh. The cement between the tiles was still damp with a moisture that shouldn't have existed in a house that had been empty for months. The rational part of my mind began its defensive work immediately. Old houses settled unpredictably. Temperature changes could cause ceramic to crack in unexpected patterns. My eyes, tired from hours of screen work, could have created visual patterns where none existed. The human brain excelled at finding meaning in randomness. But rationality couldn't explain the cold that had moved with me, or the absolute clarity with which I had seen a man who cast no shadow. That night, I called my sister in Boston, not to discuss what had happened. I wasn't ready to voice it, wasn't ready to hear my own words describe something impossible, but because I needed to hear a familiar voice, needed to anchor myself to a world where colonial ghosts didn't walk through rented houses. She mentioned that I sounded tired, asked if I was eating well, reminded me to get enough sleep. Normal concerns that felt precious in their mundane simplicity. When she asked if everything was all right, I almost told her. Almost. Instead, I assured her that Cartagena was beautiful and my work was progressing well. Both statements felt like lies. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The house seemed more alive in darkness, filled with sounds that old buildings make. Settling wood, shifting stones. The distant murmur of the Caribbean breeze through shutters. But underneath those explainable noises, I began to notice others. Footsteps that followed no pattern I could map. Doors that creaked open and closed in rooms I had already checked. The soft whisper of fabric against walls. I found myself listening with an intensity that made my ears ring, straining to separate real sounds from the paranoid amplifications of an overactive mind. Every noise became significant, every silence pregnant with possibility. By morning, I had convinced myself that stress and isolation were playing tricks on my perception. A few days in a new environment, immersed in historical documents about a colonial period marked by exploitation and suffering, of course my subconscious would conjure appropriate imagery. The mind was a powerful engine for creating meaning, especially when that meaning confirmed existing anxieties. I decided to ignore what had happened and focus on my work. The decision lasted until 3 o'clock that afternoon. This time, I was ready. I had positioned myself in the main room with a view of the entire space, my laptop closed, my attention focused. At exactly 3 p.m., the cold returned. It started as a subtle chill along my spine, then spread outward like spilled liquid nitrogen, creating that same localized sphere of winter air that defied every law of thermodynamics I understood. He appeared in the same place, near the front entrance, and followed the exact same path. Same dark coat, same deliberate pace, same absolute silence. But this time, I noticed details that fear had prevented me from processing before. His face was gaunt, marked with the kind of deep lines that spoke of chronic stress rather than age. His eyes never moved from his destination, as if he walked this route from memory, guided by some internal compass that never wavered. When he reached the spot where his path would take him out of my sight, he stopped, turned, looked directly at me. His eyes held the weight of centuries, but not wisdom, exhaustion. The bone-deep tiredness of someone who had been walking the same route for longer than memory could contain. When our gazes met, the cold intensified until my hands began to shake. And something passed between us that wasn't communication but recognition. He knew I could see him. And I knew, with the certainty that comes before rational thought, that this was not the first time someone had watched him make this walk. He turned away and continued his path, leaving behind fresh cracks in the ceramic tiles that formed new symbols I didn't recognize. When the temperature returned to normal, I found myself shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper. The primitive fear that comes when the universe reveals itself to be far stranger and less stable than we pretend. I photographed the new cracks with my phone, then spent the afternoon researching colonial symbolism. The patterns matched merchant codes used to mark safe passage routes during the Spanish colonial period. But these particular symbols indicated something else. Warnings about disputed territory, areas where different authorities claimed jurisdiction, places where travelers might disappear into legal limbo. The rational explanations began to feel thin, stretched over a growing certainty that something was trying to communicate with me through cracked ceramics and impossible cold. That evening, I walked through the old quarter, hoping that fresh air and the reality of living, breathing people would restore my equilibrium. Cartagena's streets teemed with vendors, tourists, children playing soccer in small plazas. The city hummed with life, every surface touched by Caribbean sunlight that seemed to burn away shadows and their hidden possibilities. I stopped at a small cafe where an elderly man served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. When I mentioned the address where I was staying, his expression changed. He looked at me with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for people displaying symptoms of mental illness. He asked if I had noticed anything unusual about the house. The question hung between us like smoke. I could have dismissed it, laughed it off, maintained the fiction that nothing strange was happening. Instead, I told him about the cold, about the figure, about the cracked tiles. He nodded as if these details confirmed something he already knew. Then he told me about Don Eduardo Herrera, a colonial-era merchant who had owned that house in the 1740s. Herrera had made his fortune in the Caribbean trade, but his success had come at a cost that went beyond money. He had been forced to make certain accommodations with authorities who operated outside normal legal frameworks, compromises that required him to forget what he had seen, ignore what he knew, and keep walking the same safe paths, even when those paths led nowhere. The old man's story didn't end with Herrera's death. It ended with his inability to stop walking. I thanked him for the coffee and the story, treating both as equally satisfying. But as I walked back through darkening streets, his words followed me like footsteps I couldn't quite hear. That night, I dreamed about trade routes that led through dimensions instead of geography, about merchants who sold more than goods, about colonial systems that had created debts that transcended death. I woke with the absolute certainty that someone was watching me sleep, but when I turned on the lights, the room was empty except for the faint scent of wool and the sea. The next afternoon, I waited for 3 o'clock with the anticipation of a researcher on the verge of a significant discovery. I had prepared, camera ready, notebook open, every sense focused on documenting what happened. The cold arrived on schedule, and so did he. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 figures walked the path in single file, each separated by perhaps 50 years of fashion. The first wore Herrera's dark coat. The second was dressed in the style of the early 1800s. The third wore a suit that might have been fashionable in the 1920s. All followed the same route with the same mechanical precision, their footsteps leaving the same symbolic cracks in tiles that already bore the accumulated marks of previous passages. The cold was no longer localized to my position. It filled the entire room, turning my breath visible and making my skin burn with the kind of pain that comes from touching dry ice. When the procession reached the point where they would normally disappear from view, all 3 stopped and turned to look at me. Their eyes held the same exhausted recognition I had seen before, but multiplied. They weren't just tired, they were drowning in repetition, trapped in a cycle that demanded they keep walking the same path, while reality slowly cracked around them. The youngest of the 3, the man in the 1920s suit, opened his mouth as if to speak. No sound emerged, but I understood anyway. The message wasn't delivered through words, but through the sudden knowledge that appeared in my mind like a file downloaded directly to my consciousness. They weren't ghosts. They were still alive, still walking, still trying to complete a journey that had begun 3 centuries ago and would continue for 3 centuries more. The house wasn't haunted. It was a way station, a checkpoint on a route that existed parallel to the normal world, intersecting with it only at specific times and places. And I was being invited to join them. The realization came with a package of additional knowledge that I neither wanted nor could reject. The route they walked wasn't limited to this house. It extended throughout the colonial world, connecting points where the old trade networks had operated outside normal legal frameworks. Every afternoon at 3, in hundreds of locations across the Caribbean, South America, and Spain, these merchants continued their work, carrying goods that couldn't be described and serving customers who paid in currencies that had no names. The invitation wasn't optional. My presence in the house, my ability to see them, the fact that I had witnessed their passage 3 times, all of it meant that I had been selected for recruitment into a system that predated and would outlast any government or economy I understood. The cracks in the tiles weren't symbols. They were a map, and I was being asked to learn the route. The 3 figures waited with infinite patience while I processed this information. The cold had become a living thing that pressed against my skin and filled my lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. Time moved differently in their presence. Seconds stretched into hours while the world outside the house continued at normal speed. I could feel my resistance weakening, not through force, but through the slow erosion of my certainty about what was real and what was possible. The skepticism that had always protected me began to feel like just another form of self-deception, a comfortable lie that ignored the evidence of my own senses. But some part of me, The part that had always questioned authority and refused easy answers recognized that this was how it happened. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual acceptance of the impossible, one small compromise at a time. First you see them, then you understand them, then you join them, and once you start walking their route, you never stop. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, using the time to choose between sanity and truth, between the safe world I understood and the dangerous one that actually existed. When I opened them, the figures were gone, the temperature had returned to normal, and the tiles showed no new cracks. But the knowledge remained, sitting in my mind like a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout. I packed my belongings that night and left Cartagena the next morning, 3 weeks before my rental was scheduled to end. The real estate agent seemed unsurprised when I called to explain my early departure, and she didn't ask for details. Now I'm back in Boston, writing this account while sitting in my university office, where fluorescent lights burn away shadows and reality operates according to rules I can verify and trust. My research project was completed using digital archives and secondary sources. I never returned to the colonial quarter, never walked those cobblestone streets where afternoon shadows stretch between buildings that remember too much. But every day at 3 p.m., no matter where I am, I feel a subtle chill along my spine and catch myself looking for cracks in whatever floor I'm standing on. The knowledge they gave me hasn't faded. If anything, it's grown stronger, more insistent, accompanied by a growing certainty that my early departure was not an escape, but a postponement. The invitation remains open. The route continues to exist, connecting points across space and time where commerce operates according to older rules than supply and demand. And somewhere in a yellow house in Cartagena, ceramic tiles are still cracking in patterns that map journeys no living person should have to make. I tell myself it was stress, isolation, the power of suggestion working on a mind immersed in colonial history. I've returned to my normal life, my rational worldview, my comfortable skepticism about things that can't be measured or proven. But late at night, when academic certainty feels thin and the world reveals itself to be stranger than our theories allow, I remember the weight of centuries in those exhausted eyes, and I wonder how long I can keep refusing to acknowledge what I know to be true. The tiles in my apartment bathroom have started showing hairline cracks that weren't there before. They form no recognizable pattern yet, but I've stopped looking too closely. Some roots once revealed are difficult to ignore forever. Story 2. The clay felt wrong under my fingertips. I should have turned back when I first noticed it. That peculiar coldness seeping through the reddish earth, as if something had drained all warmth from the hillside. But I'd driven 3 hours to reach this remote trail in the Appalachian foothills, and my pride wouldn't let me retreat from what the locals called Devil's Backbone, a near-vertical clay cliff that jutted from the forest like a broken bone. The morning mist clung to the tree line below, creating an unsettling silence that seemed to muffle even my own breathing. No birds sang, no insects hummed, just the soft scraping of my boots against the unstable surface as I began my ascent, each step sending small avalanches of rusty earth tumbling into the void below. I'd been climbing for 20 minutes when the sensation started, that crawling awareness between my shoulder blades that meant someone was watching. I paused, pressing my chest against the cliff face, and glanced down. Nothing but fog and shadows. The trail I'd followed to reach the base had vanished completely in the thick white shroud. My fingers found purchase in a narrow crack, and I hauled myself higher. The clay here felt different, almost gritty, and when I brought my hand closer to examine it, I noticed dark flecks mixed in with the red earth. They looked organic, like fragments of something that had once been alive. The wind picked up, carrying with it an odor I couldn't place, metallic and sharp, like copper pennies left in the rain. It reminded me of something from my childhood, something I couldn't quite grasp, but it made my stomach clench with an inexplicable dread. Halfway up the cliff, the feeling of being observed intensified. My skin prickled as if invisible eyes were cataloging my every movement, measuring my worthiness for some unknown purpose. I forced myself to focus on the climb, but my peripheral vision kept catching movement. Shadows that shifted when they shouldn't. shapes that resolved into nothing when I turned to look directly. The clay became increasingly unstable as I climbed higher. Chunks broke away at my touch, forcing me to test each handhold carefully before committing my full weight. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air, and my breathing grew labored. The sensation of being watched had evolved into something more intimate, as if whatever observed me was drawing closer, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I was perhaps 30 feet from the top when it happened. My left foot slipped without warning, sending a cascade of clay tumbling into the mist below. My right hand, stretched too far for a questionable hold, lost its grip. For one terrifying moment, I hung by my fingertips from a narrow ledge, the weight of my gear pulling me backward toward a fall that would break every bone in my body. That's when I felt it, a firm palm pressing against my climbing vest, right between my shoulder blades. The touch was unmistakably human, warm and solid, pushing me forward against the cliff face with just enough force to help me regain my balance. I scrambled for new handholds, my heart hammering against my ribs, and managed to pull myself onto a more stable section of the ascent. I twisted around immediately, expecting to see another climber, perhaps someone who had taken a different route up the cliff face. But there was nothing behind me except empty air and the dizzying drop to the forest below. No ropes, no gear, no sign that anyone else had been there at all. My hands shook as I clung to the rock, trying to process what had just happened. The palm had been real. I could still feel the pressure where it had touched my vest, could still sense the warmth it had left behind. But that was impossible. No one could have reached that spot without equipment, and I'd seen no other climbers on the trail. The wind gusted again, stronger this time, and I caught a sound that made my blood freeze, the soft scrape of boots on stone coming from directly above me. Someone was moving on the cliff face overhead, their footsteps deliberate and measured, as if they were descending to meet me. I forced myself to resume climbing, driven now by something beyond mere determination. The footsteps continued above, always staying just out of sight, matching my pace with an eerie precision. When I paused, they paused. When I moved, they moved. It was as if my unseen companion was mirroring my every action, maintaining a constant distance between us. The final 20 feet of the climb proved the most treacherous. The clay here was so loose it crumbled at the slightest touch, and I found myself relying more on momentum than technique, scrambling upward in short, desperate bursts. The footsteps above had stopped, but the sensation of being watched had intensified to an almost unbearable degree. When I finally hauled myself over the edge and onto the flat summit, my legs gave out from exhaustion and nervous tension. I lay on my back for several minutes, staring up at the gray sky and trying to slow my racing heart. The silence up here was even more profound than it had been below. No wind, no distant traffic, nothing but the sound of my own labored breathing. Eventually, I rolled over and pushed myself to my feet, surveying my surroundings. The summit was smaller than I'd expected, perhaps 20 feet across, with sparse grass and a few stunted trees clinging to the rocky soil. But what captured my attention immediately were the tracks. Boot prints, clear and fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth near the cliff's edge. Military-style boots, judging by the distinctive tread pattern, size 11 or 12. They appeared suddenly about 10 feet from where I'd emerged, as if their owner had materialized from thin air, and they led in a straight line toward the opposite side of the summit. I followed them, my scalp tingling with apprehension. The prints were perfectly preserved, showing no signs of age or weathering despite being exposed to the elements. Each impression was deep and precise, made by someone carrying significant weight, gear, perhaps, or equipment that would explain their presence on this remote clifftop. But as I traced the trail, my confusion deepened. The prints led directly to the edge of the cliff, not the gradual slope that descended into the valley, but the sheer drop that fell away into nothingness. And there, at the very brink of the precipice, they simply ended. I crept forward, my stomach churning with vertigo, and peered over the edge. The cliff face below was even more vertical than the route I'd climbed, offering no possible foothold or ledge where someone could stand. Yet the final boot print was positioned exactly at the rim, the toe extending slightly over the edge, as if its owner had been standing in empty air. The implications hit me like a physical blow. No human being could have made that final print and survived. The position was impossible, defying every law of physics and common sense. Yet there it was, clear as daylight, pressed into the earth with the same precision as all the others. I backed away from the edge, my mind reeling. The palm on my vest, the footsteps during my climb, the impossible tracks. Everything pointed to a presence that couldn't exist, shouldn't exist, yet had undeniably saved my life. That's when I noticed the other details I'd missed in my initial shock. Scattered among the boot prints were small metal objects, half buried in the soil. I knelt and brushed the dirt away from one of them, revealing a tarnished brass button bearing the insignia of a military unit I didn't recognize. The metal was cold to the touch, far colder than the surrounding earth, and seemed to pulse with an energy that made my fingertips tingle. Near the button, I found other artifacts. A section of rotted fabric that might once have been olive drab, a corroded buckle from what looked like military webbing, and strangest of all, a set of dog tags so weathered the letters were barely legible. I could make out only fragments of the inscription. PFC, 1952, missing. The year struck me like a slap. 1952. 70 years ago. If these belonged to the owner of the boot prints, then whoever had pushed me to safety during my climb had been dead for decades. I sat back on my heels, trying to process this revelation. The logical part of my mind insisted there had to be another explanation. Coincidence, hallucination, some trick of adrenaline and altitude that had made me imagine the helping hand. But the evidence was right there in front of me, impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. The wind returned, stronger now, whipping across the summit with a mournful sound that might have been voices. And in that wind, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The soft jingle of military gear, the creak of leather, the measured cadence of boots on stone. I spun around, searching for the source of the sounds, but the summit remained empty except for the scattered artifacts and the impossible tracks. Yet the sensation of being observed had returned with renewed intensity, as if my discovery of the dog tags had awakened something that had been waiting patiently for acknowledgement. The temperature began to drop perceptibly. My breath started misting in the suddenly frigid air, and the grass around the boot prints began to glisten with frost despite the mild weather. The cold seemed to emanate from the tracks themselves, spreading outward in a slowly expanding circle that made the earth crack and pop with crystallizing moisture. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape the supernatural chill, but found my retreat blocked by something I couldn't see. The air itself seemed solid, pushing back against me with the same firm pressure I'd felt during my climb. I was trapped between the impossible cold and an invisible barrier that felt disturbingly familiar, like the palm of a giant hand holding me in place. That's when I saw him. Not clearly, never clearly, just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow that seemed more substantial than the others. He stood at the precise spot where the boot prints ended, his form wavering like heat shimmer, neither fully present nor entirely absent. What I could make out suggested a young man in military fatigues, though the details shifted and blurred whenever I tried to focus on them directly. He was watching me, I realized. Had been watching me all along, probably long before I'd begun my climb. Measuring me, perhaps, or testing my worthiness for some purpose I couldn't begin to fathom. The helping hand during my near fall hadn't been a spontaneous gesture. It had been a calculated intervention, the action of a guardian who had decided I deserved to reach the summit alive. But why? What made me special enough to warrant supernatural protection? Or was I simply the latest in a long line of climbers who had received his aid? A roster of names stretching back 70 years to whatever tragedy had first bound him to this desolate place. The questions multiplied in my mind, each one spawning a dozen others, until my thoughts became a chaotic tangle of speculation and growing dread. Because if he was real, if what I was experiencing truly was the manifestation of a dead soldier's spirit, then what did his continued presence mean? What was he still guarding, still protecting, that kept him anchored to this clifftop decades after his death? The wind died away suddenly, leaving a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. In that absolute quiet, I heard something that nearly stopped my heart. The soft whisper of my own name, spoken in a voice that sounded like distant radio static. He knew who I was, had been waiting specifically for me. The realization hit me with such force that my knees buckled. This wasn't a random encounter with a restless spirit. This was a planned meeting, an appointment I'd unknowingly kept by choosing to climb Devil's Backbone on this particular day. But planned by whom? And for what purpose? The shadow figure moved then, taking a single step that should have sent him plummeting over the cliff edge, but instead brought him closer to where I knelt among the scattered artifacts. His form solidified slightly, enough for me to glimpse details that made my heart race. The same military insignia I'd found on the button, the same unit markings that adorned the corroded dog tags. And his face, when the shifting shadows allowed me to see it clearly for just an instant, bore an expression of such profound loneliness that it took my breath away. This wasn't a malevolent spirit or a vengeful ghost. This was a young man who had died far from home, who had been standing guard on this remote clifftop for 7 decades, waiting for someone who would finally understand what he was trying to protect. Me. The knowledge came not as a conscious realization, but as a sudden, inexplicable certainty that settled into my mind like a key turning in a lock. I was the one he'd been waiting for, the person who would finally see past the impossible nature of his existence to recognize the deeper truth beneath. But what was that truth? What secret was worth a 70-year vigil on this desolate summit? The answer, when it came, arrived not through words or visions, but through a gradual shift in my perception, as if a fog was slowly lifting from my thoughts. The artifacts scattered around the boot prints weren't random debris from a long-ago military operation. They were breadcrumbs, clues left deliberately for someone with the wisdom to interpret them correctly. The date on the dog tags, 1952, the year the Korean War was raging, when young soldiers disappeared into the mountains and valleys of a foreign land, many never to return. But this wasn't Korea. This was Appalachia, thousands of miles from any battlefield. So what was a soldier doing here, in this remote corner of the American wilderness? Unless... The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. The missing persons reports from the early 1950s, the whispered local legends about government experiments in these hills, the persistent rumors of classified projects that had gone wrong and been hastily covered up. I'd dismissed them all as folklore, the kind of conspiracy theories that flourished in isolated communities with too much time and too few facts. But what if they were true? What if something had happened here in 1952? Something so terrible that it had required a cover-up spanning generations? And what if this young soldier had been assigned to guard the site, to ensure that whatever had been buried here stayed buried forever? The shadow figure nodded slowly, as if confirming my growing understanding. His form was more solid now, solid enough for me to see the exhaustion in his stance, the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. He had been faithfully executing his orders for 70 years, standing watch over a secret that could never be allowed to surface. But now he was tired, ready to pass the responsibility to someone else, someone who could carry the burden of knowledge without being crushed by it. Someone who could be trusted to maintain the vigil, even if it meant sacrificing a normal life, even if it meant accepting a truth too dangerous to share with the world. I wanted to refuse. Every rational instinct screamed at me to reject what I was being asked to accept, but deep in my bones, I felt the truth of it. The certainty that some secrets were too important to abandon, too potentially catastrophic to ignore. And somewhere in the fog of my reeling thoughts, I realized that I'd already made my choice. Had made it the moment I decided to climb this particular cliff on this particular day. The wind returned with a sound like distant thunder, and when it died away again, I was alone on the summit. The shadow figure had vanished, leaving behind only the boot prints and the scattered artifacts as proof of our encounter. But I could feel his presence still, not gone but somehow transferred, integrated into my own awareness like a passenger settling in for a long journey. I gathered up the artifacts with hands that trembled only slightly, wrapping them carefully in my spare shirt before tucking them into my pack. Evidence of what? I wasn't sure anymore. Evidence of something that couldn't be allowed to surface. Something that required a guardian willing to spend his life ensuring it stayed hidden. The descent took twice as long as the climb, not because of physical difficulty, but because I kept stopping to look back at the summit, searching for signs of movement among the sparse trees. I saw nothing, but I felt watched nonetheless, not by hostile eyes now, but by grateful ones. The sensation followed me all the way to my car and remained with me during the long drive home. That was 3 months ago. I've returned to Devil's Backbone 17 times since then, always alone, always carrying the artifacts I'd found on that first visit. I tell people I'm studying local geology, researching erosion patterns for a paper I'll never write. They accept the explanation without question, perhaps because something in my manner discourages further inquiry. I've learned things during these visits, fragments of truth that surface in dreams and half-remembered conversations with figures who may or may not exist. The soldier's name was David Kowalski, 19 years old when he died guarding something that should never have been created. The project had a designation, Operation Midnight Garden, but no official records remain. The participants were sworn to secrecy under threat of prosecution, and most took their knowledge to the grave. But not all. Sometimes, late at night when the summit is shrouded in fog, other figures join me around the weathered boot prints. Old men mostly, their faces marked by decades of carefully guarded secrets. They speak in whispers about things that should have stayed buried, about experiments that pushed beyond the boundaries of human understanding into territories that were never meant to be explored. And they confirm what I've already begun to suspect, that my encounter with David Kowalski was only the beginning. That there are other sites scattered across these mountains, other guardians maintaining their vigils over secrets too dangerous to abandon. A network of watchers bound together by knowledge and duty, each one chosen not by chance, but by some quality that makes them suitable keepers of truths that could reshape the world, or destroy it. I've stopped asking myself whether I'm losing my sanity. The question has become irrelevant, a luxury I can no longer afford. What matters now is the certainty that some things are more important than personal peace of mind, more vital than the comfortable illusion of a world where the impossible doesn't exist. David Kowalski understood that, spent 70 years proving it. Now it's my turn. The boot prints are still there when I visit the summit, frozen in the moment of their creation. But they're fainter now, as if his long vigil is finally ending. Soon they'll fade completely, leaving behind only the knowledge of what lies buried beneath this remote clifftop and the unwavering certainty that it must never be disturbed. I've made my peace with that responsibility. Some guardians are chosen by circumstance, others by fate. A few, like me, are chosen by the grateful dead, who can finally rest, knowing their duty has been passed to worthy hands. The question that haunts my dreams isn't whether I'm real or imaginary, sane or psychotic. It's simpler and infinitely more disturbing. If I die tomorrow, who will David Kowalski choose to replace me? And what will it cost them to accept? Story 3. The laughter started 3 weeks after I moved into the house on Elm Street. Every afternoon at exactly 3:47 p.m., like clockwork, the sound would drift over the weathered brick wall that separated my backyard from the vacant lot next door. High-pitched, innocent, the kind of giggling that should have brought comfort, but instead sent ice crawling up my spine. Because I knew, absolutely knew, that no children lived there. The realtor had been clear about the neighboring property. Abandoned for nearly 2 decades, the lot had once housed the Riverside Children's Home, demolished after some scandal in the early 2000s. Now it was just overgrown grass, twisted metal foundations, and the skeletal remains of what might have once been playground equipment, all hidden behind that imposing wall topped with rusted barbed wire. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was kids from the street, sneaking onto the property to play. Maybe the sound carried from elsewhere. Acoustic tricks played by the wind and the strange geography of suburban backyards. But as the days stretched into weeks, the laughter became impossible to dismiss. It wasn't just the timing, that precise 3:47 arrival, but the quality of the sound itself. Sometimes it seemed to come from just beyond the wall, so close I could almost feel breath on the back of my neck. Other times it echoed as if originating from somewhere deep underground, muffled by earth and time. The worst part was how it never lasted long enough for me to pinpoint its source. Just when I'd grab my phone to record it, or step closer to the wall to investigate, the laughter would fade like smoke, leaving only the ordinary sounds of afternoon: distant traffic, a neighbor's lawnmower, the whistle of wind through the oak trees. By the fourth week, I'd developed an uncomfortable routine. Every day at 3:45, I'd find myself gravitating toward the kitchen window that offered the best view of my backyard and the wall beyond. I'd stand there, coffee mug in hand, watching and waiting like some suburban sentinel. My work-from-home schedule made this obsession easier to maintain, and I told myself it was just curiosity, a minor mystery to solve. The afternoon I decided to investigate was unseasonably warm for October. I'd been working on a particularly frustrating coding project when 3:47 arrived with its punctual serenade. But this time, instead of fading quickly, the laughter lingered. It seemed to bounce between the walls of the neighboring lot, creating an almost echo chamber effect that made my teeth ache. I set down my laptop and walked outside. The October air felt thick, pregnant with the smell of decomposing leaves and something else. Something metallic and earthy that I couldn't identify. My backyard, normally a source of pride with its neat flower beds and trimmed hedges, suddenly felt exposed. The sensation of being watched pressed against my shoulders like invisible hands. The laughter continued, now definitely coming from the other side of the wall. I approached slowly, my feet silent on the grass I'd mowed just 2 days earlier. The brick wall stood 8 feet high, too tall to see over without a ladder, but there was a gap near the bottom where years of weather had loosened the mortar. I knelt and pressed my face to the opening. What I saw made my breath catch. The lot wasn't empty. Scattered across the overgrown grass were patches of disturbed earth, each about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. Rectangular depressions in the ground, arranged in neat rows like a garden plot. But these weren't flower beds. The proportions, the methodical spacing, the way the earth seemed to have settled over time, they looked like graves. Small graves. And leading between them, pressed deep into the soft October soil, were footprints, child-sized footprints, bare feet with distinct toe impressions. They wove between the rectangular depressions in a seemingly random pattern, as if whoever made them had been playing some invisible game of hopscotch among the settled earth. I jerked back from the gap, my heart hammering against my ribs. The laughter had stopped. In its place came a silence so complete it felt intentional, like the world holding its breath. I stood on unsteady legs, brushing dirt from my knees, and tried to process what I'd seen. Those couldn't be graves. The city would never allow something like that. There had to be a logical explanation, maybe old foundation work or drainage issues But even as I ran through possibilities, I knew I was lying to myself. The spacing was too deliberate, too uniform. And those footprints, so fresh they still held the perfect detail of small toes and instep arches. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching the Riverside Children's Home. What I found in old newspaper archives made my coffee go cold. The facility had been shut down in 2003 following an investigation into irregularities in record-keeping and resident care. The articles were vague, couched in the careful language of legal liability, but reading between the lines painted a disturbing picture. Children had gone missing from the home over the years, their disappearances explained as runaways or transfers to other facilities. But the records were incomplete, contradictory. Some children seemed to have simply vanished from all official documentation. The most chilling detail came from a former employee who spoke anonymously to a local reporter. They said the children who got sick went to the infirmary, but there was no infirmary, just the cellar, and that back garden where no one was supposed to go. I closed my laptop as the sun began to set, my hands trembling slightly. Outside, the afternoon was fading into that gray hour between day and night when shadows grow long and familiar things take on sinister shapes. I found myself avoiding the kitchen window, but eventually hunger drove me to the refrigerator. That's when I saw them again. More footprints, this time in my own backyard. They started at the wall and walked directly toward my house, leaving perfect impressions in the soft earth around my flower beds. Small bare feet that had somehow scaled an 8-foot wall topped with barbed wire landed silently in my yard and approached my home while I sat unaware at my desk. But here's what made my skin crawl. The footprints ended exactly 6 feet from my back door. They didn't circle the house or return to the wall. They simply stopped, as if whoever made them had evaporated into the evening air. I grabbed a flashlight and examined the tracks more closely. The impressions were deep, detailed, unmistakably real. But as I followed them from the wall toward my house, something impossible became apparent. With each step closer to my door, the footprints grew fainter. By the time they reached that 6-foot mark, they were barely visible depressions in the soil. And beyond that point, nothing. Not even disturbed grass where someone might have stepped. Standing in my backyard with a flashlight in my shaking hand, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. The sensation was so strong I spun around, sweeping the beam across my yard, the wall, the dark windows of my house. Nothing, but the feeling persisted, a crawling certainty that I was being observed from multiple directions at once. I hurried inside and locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified. The house settling, branches scraping against the roof, the distant hum of the refrigerator. But underneath these normal noises, I kept hearing something else. Soft footsteps on hardwood floors, the quiet creak of stairs. Sounds that could have been the old house adjusting to the October cold, but which my overwrought mind interpreted as something, moving through the rooms below. The next morning, I called the city planning office. I needed to know about the lot next door, needed official confirmation of what I'd seen. The clerk who answered was helpful but puzzled by my questions about the former children's home. Riverside Children's Home? She paused and I heard typing. I'm not showing any record of that facility in our database. What address are you looking at? I gave her the street address, described the location, mentioned the vacant lot. More typing, longer pauses. Sir, according to our records, that lot has been vacant since 1987. It was rezoned for residential development, but never built on due to soil conditions. There's no record of any institutional use. After I hung up, I sat staring at my laptop screen. The newspaper articles I'd found the night before seemed less reliable now, their details fuzzy in the harsh light of morning. Had I really read about missing children in basement burials, or had my tired mind filled in blanks with its own fears? But the footprints were real. I checked them again that morning, and they were still there, still ending at that impossible 6-foot mark. The laughter came again at 3:47 p.m., and this time I was ready. I had my phone set to record, my shoes by the back door, a plan to document whatever was happening next door. But when the sound began, I found myself frozen at the kitchen window, unable to move, because this time I could see the source. Through the gap in the wall, barely visible in the afternoon shadows, shapes moved among the rectangular depressions in the earth. Small figures, translucent as heat shimmer, playing some silent game between the settled graves. They ran and darted, their movements creating no sound except that impossible laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I watched, phone forgotten in my hand, as one of the figures approached the wall. It was child-sized, wearing what might have been old-fashioned clothing, a simple dress or shirt that moved without wind. As it drew closer to the gap where I crouched watching, details became clearer, but not the details I expected. The figure had no face. Where features should have been was only smooth blank space, like an unfinished sculpture. Yet somehow I knew it was looking at me, studying me with that featureless visage tilted in curious observation. We regarded each other through the gap in the wall, the living and the... what? Ghost? Hallucination? Manifestation of guilt over children I'd never known. Then it raised one small hand and pressed it against the wall, directly over the gap. On my side of the brick barrier, I felt a sudden, shocking cold. My breath misted in the warm October air, and frost began forming on the mortar around the opening. I stumbled backward, my phone finally slipping from numb fingers to shatter on the patio stones. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it made my ears ring. But in that silence, I heard something else. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across stone. The sound was coming from inside my house. I turned toward the back door, and there, pressed against the glass, were small handprints, dozens of them, overlapping and fresh, as if a crowd of children had been trying to get inside while I stood distracted in the yard. The prints covered the glass from top to bottom, some so high they could only have been made by someone floating in the air. But I was looking at them from the outside. The handprints were on the interior surface of the glass. Whatever had made them was already inside my house. The scratching continued, a sound like chalk on a blackboard that made my teeth ache. It seemed to move through the house, traveling from room to room with deliberate purpose. I followed the sound with my eyes, tracking its progress through my living room, up the stairs, into my bedroom. My bedroom, where my laptop sat open with all my research about the Riverside Children's Home. Research that, according to the city clerk, documented a facility that had never existed. Standing in my backyard as the October afternoon faded toward evening, I faced a choice that no rational person should have to make. I could go inside and confront whatever was making those sounds, or I could run, leave everything behind and flee from a house that had somehow become infected with impossibilities. But as I stood there weighing my options, I noticed something that made the choice for me. The footprints in my yard, the ones that had ended 6 feet from my door, were moving. New impressions appeared in the soft earth, step by step, approaching my position. Invisible feet walking across my lawn, coming toward me with measured, inevitable progress. I ran for the back door, keys fumbling in my shaking hands. Behind me, I could feel the presence getting closer, and when I finally got the door open and stumbled inside, I could have sworn I felt cold breath on the back of my neck. The scratching sound had stopped. My house felt different now, charged with an energy that made the air thick and hard to breathe. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner potentially occupied. I moved through my own home like a stranger, checking rooms that somehow felt foreign despite containing my own furniture, my own belongings. In my bedroom, my laptop screen glowed with the newspaper articles I'd been reading. But the text had changed. Where I remembered reading about missing children and suspicious deaths, now I found only innocent stories about a successful youth facility that had closed due to funding issues. The anonymous employee quote about the cellar and the back garden was gone, replaced by a testimonial from a grateful former resident. I refreshed the page. The articles changed again, this time describing Riverside Children's Home as a model facility that had never experienced any problems whatsoever. Another refresh brought a completely different story, a brief mention of a children's home that had been destroyed in a fire, with all residents safely evacuated. Each time I reloaded the page, the history changed. The only constant was the facility's existence and its location on the lot next door. But the details, the dark rumors, the missing children, the implications of improper burials, shifted like sand, impossible to pin down or verify. I closed the laptop with shaking hands and tried to think rationally. Stress could cause hallucinations. Lack of sleep could distort perception. Maybe I'd been working too hard, spending too much time alone, allowing my imagination to transform normal neighborhood sounds into something sinister. But then I heard the laughter again. This time it came from inside the house, from upstairs, from my own bedroom where I'd just been sitting. The sound drifted down the stairs like cold air, that same innocent giggling that had started it all. But now it was accompanied by other sounds. The soft patter of feet on hardwood, the quiet creak of floorboards adjusting to small weights. I stood frozen in my living room, listening to invisible children play in the rooms above my head. The footsteps moved with purpose, as if exploring every corner of my home, mapping its layout for some unknown purpose. Occasionally I heard what might have been whispered voices, Too soft to understand, but clearly communicating in the universal language of childhood games. The rational part of my mind suggested carbon monoxide poisoning, or a gas leak, or some other environmental factor that could cause auditory hallucinations. But when I checked the detectors, they showed normal readings. My phone worked fine when I tried to call for help. But how do you explain to emergency services that your house has been invaded by the ghosts of children who may or may not have ever existed? As the sun set completely, plunging my neighborhood into the deep darkness of an October evening, the sounds upstairs grew more active. It was as if the approaching night gave them strength, permission to be more present in my world. I heard what sounded like furniture being moved, drawers opening and closing, the soft thud of small feet jumping from bed to floor. But when I climbed the stairs to investigate, I found my bedroom exactly as I'd left it. Bed made, laptop closed, everything in its proper place. The only difference was the temperature. It was noticeably colder upstairs, cold enough that my breath formed small clouds in the air. And on my pillow, pressed deep into the fabric as if someone had been sleeping there, was the clear impression of a small head. I backed out of the room and spent the night downstairs, dozing fitfully in my recliner with every light in the house blazing. The sounds continued through the dark hours. Footsteps, laughter, the occasional creak of a door opening somewhere in the shadows. But I didn't investigate. I'd learned that looking for the source of these manifestations only raised more questions I couldn't answer. By morning, exhaustion had dulled my fear into a kind of resigned acceptance. Whatever was happening in my house, whatever presence had followed me home from that gap in the wall, it didn't seem malevolent. Disturbing, yes. Impossible to explain, certainly, but not actively threatening. I made coffee and stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where this had all begun. The footprints were still there, but they'd multiplied overnight. Dozens of small impressions now covered my lawn, creating intricate patterns that looked almost like crop circles. They wove around my flower beds, spiraled near the tool shed, and created what might have been hopscotch squares near the back fence. And they all led to the wall. As I watched, sipping coffee that tasted like ashes in my mouth, I saw new footprints appearing in the soft earth. Invisible feet creating visible impressions, walking in slow circles around my yard as if mapping territory or marking boundaries. The laughter began again at exactly 3:47 p.m., but this time I didn't flinch. I'd been expecting it, waiting for it, almost welcoming it as the only predictable element in a situation that had spiraled far beyond my understanding. I walked outside and approached the wall, no longer caring about rational explanations or logical outcomes. Through the gap in the brick, I could see them more clearly now. Dozens of small figures moving through the overgrown lot, playing among the rectangular depressions that might or might not be graves. Some wore old-fashioned clothing, others seemed to be dressed in more modern garments, as if they represented different eras of the facility's existence. They all had the same blank, featureless faces, but somehow I could sense their emotions. Joy, curiosity, a kind of innocent playfulness that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. They seemed aware of my presence but not threatened by it. If anything, they appeared to be trying to communicate, gesturing toward the settled earth beneath their feet, and then pointing toward my house. One of them approached the wall and knelt beside the gap where I watched. It pressed its face close to the opening, and I found myself looking into that smooth, empty visage from just inches away. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we studied each other across the boundary between whatever world they inhabited and the one I thought I knew. Then it spoke, though not with words. The voice came directly into my mind, clear as my own thoughts, but unmistakably foreign. We've been waiting. The simple statement hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over my own feet in my haste to escape that impossible communication. But the voice followed me, echoing in my skull with patient persistence. We've been waiting so long, but now you can see us. Now you can help. I ran toward my house, but the voice continued, growing stronger rather than fading with distance. The others didn't understand. They moved away, or they ignored us, or they convinced themselves we weren't real. But you kept looking. You kept listening. You're different. I slammed the back door behind me and pressed my back against it, but there was no escaping the words that came from inside my own mind. We need someone to remember. Someone to know what happened here. The truth gets lost. The records change. But the earth remembers. The ground holds our stories. My living room felt like a foreign country. Familiar objects made strange by the presence of thoughts that weren't my own. I stumbled to my laptop and opened it, desperate to document what was happening before I lost my grip on reality completely. But the screen showed only a blank document. Whatever I typed disappeared as soon as I lifted my fingers from the keys, as if the words themselves were being erased by some invisible force. "Not that way," the voice whispered. "Come back outside. Come and see." Against every instinct, every reasonable thought, I found myself walking back toward the door. The pull was gentle but irresistible, like being led by a trusted friend into unknown territory. The afternoon was fading toward evening again, and in the growing dusk, the lot next door looked different. The overgrown grass had taken on an ethereal quality, seeming to glow with its own soft light, and the figures moving among the rectangular depressions were more solid now, more present. I approached the wall and knelt beside the gap. On the other side, a small figure waited for me, its blank face somehow conveying infinite patience. "Look," it said, and pointed toward the settled earth beneath its feet. As I watched, the rectangular depressions began to change. The earth shifted and settled, revealing outlines that were unmistakably human. Child-sized forms pressed into the soil, preserved like fossils in stone. But these weren't just impressions. They were monuments, each one marking a life that had been forgotten by official records, but remembered by the ground itself. 37, the voice said. 37 children who were never reported missing because we were already missing, already forgotten, already invisible. The truth hit me like a physical weight. The children's home hadn't just closed due to scandal. It had been erasing inconvenient residents for years. Children who had no families to miss them, no advocates to ask questions, no one to notice when they simply disappeared from all records. They told us we were going to new homes, the voice continued. Better places, families who wanted us. But we never left this yard. We're still here, still waiting for someone to remember our names. I found my own voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" "Tell them. Tell everyone. Make them remember that we existed, that we mattered." As the sun set completely, the lot next door transformed. The overgrown grass became a well-maintained garden. The twisted metal foundations became the walls of a large institutional building. I could see the Riverside Children's Home as it had been in its final years, a place where unwanted children disappeared into unmarked graves in the backyard. But this vision lasted only moments. As full darkness settled over the neighborhood, the lot returned to its current state of abandonment. The building faded like smoke, leaving only the rectangular depressions and the small figures who tended them like gardeners caring for a sacred space. "Will you help us?" the voice asked, and I could hear the hope in it, the desperate need for acknowledgement that only the living could provide. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to do or how I could possibly fulfill such a promise. How do you prove the existence of children who had been systematically erased from all official records? How do you document a truth that changes every time you try to capture it? But as I knelt by the wall in my backyard, surrounded by footprints that appeared and disappeared like signatures written in water, I knew I would try. Not because I understood what was happening to me, or because I could prove any of it to the outside world, but because 37 forgotten children deserved to have their stories remembered. The laughter began again, but this time it sounded different, less desperate, more hopeful, as if, after decades of trying to get someone's attention, they had finally found a person willing to listen. "I stay in the house now, though my friends think I've lost my mind." They point to the empty lot next door, to the city records that show no children's home ever existed here, to my inability to provide any concrete evidence of what I've experienced. They suggest therapy, medication, a change of scenery. But every afternoon at 3:47, I know the truth. I see the children playing among their forgotten graves, and I hear their stories in the wind that carries their laughter over the wall. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I hear them moving through my house like honored guests, no longer desperate to be noticed, but content to simply be remembered. The footprints appear and disappear in my yard, spelling out names in the soft earth, names that fade before I can photograph them, but which I carefully write down in a notebook that stays hidden from visitors. 37 names of children who existed, who mattered, who deserved better than to be erased from history by those who were supposed to protect them. I don't know if I'm documenting the truth or chronicling my own descent into madness. The evidence changes, the records shift, and the footprints vanish whenever anyone else is watching. But in the growing darkness of each October evening, when the laughter drifts over the wall and the small figures tend their garden of memories, I know that some truths are too important to depend on proof. They're still here, still waiting, still hoping that someone will remember. And as long as I remain in this house, someone will. Story 4. The silence should have been my first warning. I'd been hiking the Appalachian backwoods for 15 years, and I knew the natural rhythm of these mountains, the constant whisper of wind through leaves, the distant call of hawks, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But here, following what my GPS insisted was a legitimate trail along this dried riverbed, the world had gone unnaturally quiet. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air had thickened around me. The riverbed stretched ahead like a scar through the landscape, its exposed stones bleached white by decades of flash floods and scorching summers. Ancient oaks and maples towered on either side, their canopy so dense that only fractured beams of late afternoon sunlight managed to penetrate the gloom. I'd chosen this route specifically for its isolation, a chance to disconnect from the digital chaos that had been consuming my life back in the city. Now, 3 hours into my solitary trek, I was beginning to question that decision. My boots crunched against the dried sediment, each step releasing small puffs of dust that seemed to hang in the still air longer than physics should allow. The GPS on my phone showed I was following a legitimate hiking path, but the trail markers had vanished somewhere back near the ridge, and I was beginning to suspect I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. The rational part of my mind insisted I should double back, but something deeper, some primal instinct I couldn't quite name, urged me forward. That's when I heard the first crack. It came from somewhere ahead and to my left, a sharp report that echoed off the riverbank walls like a gunshot. I froze, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing unusual. Just the towering sentinels of oak and maple, their trunks disappearing into the shadowy canopy above. After a long moment, I convinced myself it had been nothing more than a dead branch finally surrendering to gravity, a common enough sound in these old forests. I continued walking, but now my senses were heightened, every nerve ending alert for danger. The silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight, broken only by the soft whisper of my breathing and the rhythmic crunch of my footsteps. Then I heard it again. Another crack, this one closer and unmistakably deliberate. Not the random snap of a falling branch, but something with purpose behind it. My pace quickened involuntarily, though I tried to maintain the appearance of casual hiking. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, but the riverbed behind me remained empty, stretching back into the gathering gloom like a tunnel carved from the earth itself. The afternoon sun was sinking faster than I'd anticipated, and shadows were beginning to pool in the deeper recesses of the forest. The third crack came from directly overhead. I looked up just in time to see a massive oak, easily 100 feet tall and thick as a dining room table, begin its descent toward the riverbed. There was no wind, no obvious reason for its fall, yet down it came with gathering momentum, its ancient trunk groaning like a wounded beast. I threw myself sideways, rolling across the rocky ground as the giant crashed down exactly where I'd been standing moments before. The impact shook the earth beneath me, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that stung my eyes and filled my lungs with the sharp taste of disturbed soil. As the dust settled, I stared at the fallen giant in disbelief. The trunk had been severed cleanly at its base, as if cut by some enormous invisible blade. The stump that remained showed no signs of disease or rot, just healthy, living wood that had somehow chosen this precise moment to surrender to gravity. I scrambled to my feet, brushing dirt from my jacket, when the fourth crack split the air. This time I was watching as it happened. Another oak, this one perhaps 50 yards downstream, simply toppled without warning. No wind, no visible cause, just a sudden, deliberate collapse that sent birds I hadn't even realized were there exploding from the canopy in a panic of wings and terrified cries. The sound of their departure was the first break in the oppressive silence since I'd entered this cursed stretch of riverbed. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Drought conditions weakening root systems, underground erosion from forgotten springs, some kind of boring beetle infestation that had hollowed out the trunks from within. But even as I cataloged these possibilities, a deeper part of my consciousness was already rejecting them. This wasn't natural. This was deliberate. The fifth tree fell behind me, cutting off my retreat. I spun around to see another massive trunk blocking the path I'd just traveled, its fall perfectly timed to trap me in this narrow section of the riverbed. The precision was impossible to ignore now. Each tree had fallen with surgical accuracy, creating barriers that herded me forward like some kind of elaborate maze. Whatever was causing this, it wanted me to continue deeper into the forest. My heart was hammering against my ribs now, and a cold sweat had broken out across my forehead despite the warm afternoon air. I pulled out my phone, desperate for the comfort of connectivity, but the screen showed no signal. Not unusual in these remote areas, but deeply unsettling given my current circumstances. The GPS was still functioning though, and according to the satellite data, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, following a legitimate hiking trail through state forest land. But legitimate trails didn't behave like this. The sixth tree fell as I stood there staring at my phone, and this time I felt something else. A vibration in the ground beneath my feet, subtle but unmistakable. It started just before the crack of splitting wood, a gentle tremor that seemed to travel along the length of the riverbed, like a signal running through some vast underground nervous system. I knelt and pressed my palm against the exposed stone, and there it was again, a rhythmic pulsing, as if something massive was moving through the earth below. The logical part of my mind immediately leaped to explanations. Underground streams, tectonic activity, maybe even old mining operations that had left the substrate unstable. But logic was becoming an increasingly fragile anchor as tree after tree continued to fall with that same impossible precision. Each collapse seemed designed not just to block my path, but to guide it, forcing me ever deeper into the forest, away from anything resembling civilization. I tried calling out, shouting hello into the gathering darkness, but my voice seemed to die just a few feet from my mouth, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had settled over everything like a burial shroud. The absence of echo was particularly disturbing. Sound should bounce off these high riverbank walls, but instead it simply vanished, as if the air itself was consuming my words. The seventh tree fell directly in front of me, close enough that I felt the rush of displaced air across my face. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the rocky ground, and that's when I saw them. The cuts. Where each tree had fallen, the stump showed the same impossibly clean severance. No splintering, no tear marks from high winds or structural failure. Just smooth, precise cuts that looked almost surgical in their perfection. But there were no saw marks, no tool signatures that might explain how such massive trunks had been severed so cleanly. It was as if they'd been sliced by something invisible, something that moved through solid wood like a hot knife through butter. My breathing was coming in short, sharp gasps now, and I realized I was on the edge of full panic. I forced myself to stop, to take deeper breaths, to think rationally about what I was experiencing. There had to be an explanation, something I was missing, some obvious cause that fear was preventing me from seeing clearly. But as I stood there trying to regain my composure, the eighth tree fell, and with it came the sound I'd been unconsciously dreading. A hollow thump from beneath the ground, like footsteps in an enormous underground chamber. The vibration was stronger now, rhythmic and purposeful, traveling along the riverbed in waves that I could feel through the soles of my boots. Whatever was down there, it was moving, and it was big. The pattern of the tremors suggested something vast and deliberate, something that knew exactly where I was and was actively working to control my movements. I thought about the old stories, the ones my grandfather used to tell about things that lived beneath the mountains. Creatures older than human memory, sleeping in the deep places until something or someone disturbed their rest. I'd always dismissed such tales as folklore, the kind of myth-making that emerged naturally from isolated communities trying to explain the inexplicable. But standing here in this increasingly alien landscape, those stories didn't seem quite so fantastical anymore. The ninth tree fell as I started moving again, and this time I was certain I saw something. A flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, something large and dark that vanished the moment I turned to look directly at it. The shadows between the standing trees seemed deeper now, more solid somehow, as if they possessed a weight and substance that ordinary darkness lacked. I was running now, no longer pretending this was a casual hike gone slightly wrong. The fallen trees formed an obstacle course that forced me to climb and scramble, always pushing me further from the main trail, deeper into sections of forest that felt increasingly untamed. My rational mind kept insisting that I was experiencing some kind of psychological break, that stress and isolation were causing me to interpret natural phenomena in supernatural terms. But that explanation was becoming harder to maintain as the evidence mounted around me. The 10th tree fell just as I reached a bend in the riverbed, and with its crash came a new sound, a low rumbling moan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was too deep to be human, too organic to be geological, and it reverberated through my chest cavity like the call of some enormous whale surfacing from profound depths. I pressed myself against the riverbank wall, my back against the cold stone, and tried to make sense of what was happening. The fallen trees formed a perfect funnel now, channeling me toward whatever lay around that bend. There was no going back. Even if I could somehow climb over the massive trunks blocking my retreat, I was no longer certain I could find my way out of this maze of toppled giants. The underground movement was constant now, a steady progression that seemed to pace my own movements. Whatever was down there, it was tracking me, anticipating my path, preparing something ahead of my position. The hollow thumping had developed a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat, or perhaps breathing, the slow inhalation and exhalation of something vast beyond human comprehension. I rounded the bend and stopped dead. The riverbed opened into a natural amphitheater, its walls rising on all sides to create a perfect circular chamber, perhaps 100 yards across. The canopy overhead had grown so thick that virtually no sunlight penetrated to the floor, leaving everything bathed in a green-tinged twilight that seemed to pulse with its own subtle luminescence. But it wasn't the geological formation that made me freeze in terror, it was what had been done to it. Every tree surrounding the amphitheater had been felled with the same surgical precision I'd witnessed throughout my journey. They lay in perfect radial lines, their trunks pointing inward toward the center of the circle, like the spokes of some enormous wheel. The pattern was too precise, too deliberate to be anything but intentional, a design created by intelligence, not chance. And in the very center of this wooden mandala, the ground had begun to bulge upward. The earth was moving, rising in a perfect dome perhaps 20 feet across, as if something massive was pushing up from below. The soil cracked and shifted with each pulse of that underground heartbeat, revealing glimpses of something dark and organic beneath. Not rock or root, but something that seemed to breathe, something that pulsed with a life force that predated human existence by countless eons. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The fallen trees formed an impenetrable barrier around the amphitheater's perimeter, their arrangement ensuring that anyone who entered this space would be trapped until whatever lay beneath chose to reveal itself. The design was perfect, a trap constructed with the patience and precision of something that thought in geological timescales. The mound in the center rose higher, and I began to hear something new, a sound like vast lungs filling with air, like the breathing of something so large that each inhalation lasted minutes rather than seconds. The dome cracked open at its peak, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to absorb what little light remained in the amphitheater. And from that darkness, something began to emerge. I never saw it clearly. My mind seemed to refuse to process what my eyes were showing me, protecting my sanity by blurring the details into an impression of vast movement and alien geometry. But I felt its attention turn toward me, felt the weight of an intelligence so ancient and vast that human consciousness was barely a flicker in its peripheral vision. The trees had been falling all day not to trap me, but to guide me here, to deliver me to this thing that dwelt beneath the mountains, this entity that had been waiting with the patience of stone for someone to stumble into its domain. The underground movement hadn't been random. It had been preparation, clearing pathways, arranging the stage for this moment of contact. I stood there in that twilight amphitheater, surrounded by the precisely arranged corpses of ancient trees, and felt something fundamental in my understanding of reality begin to crack and shift. Whatever emerged from that hole in the earth wasn't bound by the rules that governed the world I thought I knew. It existed in spaces between spaces, in the hollow places beneath the familiar surface of things. And as consciousness finally began to fracture under the weight of what I was witnessing, one last thought managed to surface before darkness claimed me. I had been walking these mountains for 15 years, following the same trails, visiting the same familiar places. But this amphitheater, this perfect circular chamber with its radial arrangement of fallen giants, I had never seen it before, which meant either it had never existed until today, or I had never truly been hiking where I thought I was hiking at all. The last thing I remember is the sound of something vast and patient settling back beneath the earth, content now that it had made contact, confident that I would carry its presence with me back into the world above. Assuming, of course, that I ever found my way back at all. Story 5. The fluorescent lights above the gas station hummed with that particular frequency that gets under your skin, a sound like insects trapped in glass. It was 3:17 a.m. when he walked in, and I remember the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on the register, counting down the hours until my shift ended. The bell above the door gave its tired chime, and cold October air rushed in with him. He looked like he'd been driving for days. His jacket, a faded brown leather thing, was stained dark around the collar and sleeves with what I assumed was motor oil. His hair hung limp and greasy, framing a face that seemed carved from something harder than flesh. But it was his eyes that made me uncomfortable. They weren't looking at anything in particular, just staring through the space where I stood behind the counter. The smell hit me next. Gasoline, yes, but underneath that something else. Something organic and sour, like meat left too long in the sun. He approached the counter without browsing the shelves, without the usual hesitation of someone deciding between energy drinks or candy bars. His boots made no sound on the linoleum floor, which should have been impossible given the way his heels struck the ground. I found myself straining to hear his footsteps, as if the absence of sound was more disturbing than any noise could have been. "Need a lighter," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the casual pleasantry that even the rudest customers usually managed at this hour. No "excuse me" or "hey there," just the statement, delivered like he was reading from a script. I reached for the display case behind me, my hand trembling slightly as I selected a basic blue Bic lighter. When I turned back, he was standing closer to the counter than before. I hadn't heard him move. The transaction was wordless. He placed exact change on the counter, 4 quarters, 2 dimes, and 3 pennies, and took the lighter. Our fingers didn't touch, but I felt something like static electricity jump between us. The fluorescent lights flickered once, casting strange shadows across his face that made his features seem to shift and blur. He left as quietly as he'd entered, and I watched through the window as he walked to a dark sedan parked at the far edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the overhead lights. The car's license plate was obscured by mud, and something about its shape seemed wrong, as if it were slightly too long or too low to the ground. He got in and drove away without turning on his headlights. I told myself it was just another weird customer. Working the night shift at a rural gas station, you see all kinds. But something about the encounter left me unsettled. I found myself checking the locks on the doors repeatedly, and every time a car passed on the highway, I tensed, expecting to see that dark sedan returning. The next few days passed without incident, and I began to forget about the man with the empty eyes. It wasn't until Thursday evening, while eating dinner and half watching the local news, that everything changed. The anchor's voice seemed to fade into background noise as the photograph filled the screen. It was him, the same gaunt face, the same lifeless stare. But now I was seeing him in daylight, in a police mugshot that made his features appear even more hollow and predatory. Suspected of multiple abductions across 3 states, the anchor was saying. Harold Vance was last seen in the area early Tuesday morning, driving a dark blue sedan. Police consider him extremely dangerous and advise residents not to approach. Tuesday morning. Early Tuesday morning. I had worked Monday night into Tuesday morning. The remote control slipped from my hands and clattered to the floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in my small apartment, and for a moment I was convinced someone would respond to it. Footsteps in the hallway, a knock at the door, but there was only silence, heavy and expectant. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Lots of people had dark hair and hollow cheeks. The lighting in the gas station was terrible, casting strange shadows that could make anyone look sinister. But deep down, I knew. The man who had asked for a lighter, who had stood in my store and placed exact change on my counter, was a killer. Sleep became elusive. Every night I lay in bed replaying the encounter, searching for details I might have missed. Had he seemed agitated? Nervous? Had there been blood on his jacket, not oil? The more I thought about it, the more the memory seemed to shift and change, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I started noticing things, small things that might have been coincidence but felt like something more. The same dark sedan parked across from my apartment building when I left for work. A figure standing at the edge of the gas station lot during my shifts, just beyond the reach of the lights. The smell of gasoline and something rotten whenever I walked alone at night. My manager, Ron, noticed my deteriorating state. He was a good man, worked days, and always made sure the night shift crew felt supported. When he asked if everything was okay, I almost told him. Almost. But how do you explain that you're being watched by a killer you once sold a lighter to? How do you make someone understand that you can feel eyes on you even when you're alone? Instead, I mumbled something about insomnia and stress. Ron suggested I take a few days off, but the thought of being alone in my apartment for that long filled me with dread. At least at work, there were people passing through, the illusion of safety in numbers. It was during my shift the following Monday that I found the first note. I was restocking the cigarette display when I noticed it, tucked between 2 cartons of Marlboros. A small piece of paper, folded precisely in half. My name was written on the outside in block letters, Mike. Inside, in the same careful handwriting, "You remember me." My hand shook as I read it, and I looked around the store as if the writer might still be there, watching from behind the snack aisle. But I was alone, had been alone for over an hour. The security cameras would show me that no one had come in since my last customer, a tired trucker who'd bought coffee and beef jerky. I told myself it was a prank. Maybe one of the day shift guys was messing with me, though none of them seemed the type. I threw the note away and tried to focus on my duties, but every few minutes I found myself glancing at the trash can, half expecting the paper to have crawled back out. The second note appeared 2 days later, slipped under the windshield wiper of my car. This one was longer. "You saw my face. You know what I am, but you didn't tell. Why?" I sat in my car for 20 minutes after finding it, engine running, doors locked, scanning the parking lot for any sign of movement. The security lights created pools of yellow illumination separated by areas of impenetrable darkness. Anyone could have been hiding in those shadows, watching me read his words. That night I called the police. The officer who took my report was polite but skeptical. What crime had been committed? Someone leaving notes wasn't illegal unless they were threatening, and these weren't exactly threats. They were questions. The officer suggested I install security cameras, maybe stay with a friend for a few days. But I didn't have friends. Not really. The night shift job had isolated me from most social connections, and my family lived 3 states away. I was alone with whatever was happening to me. The third note was waiting on my pillow when I got home from work. My hands went numb as I stared at it, trying to process the impossibility of its presence. I had locked my apartment. I always locked my apartment. The deadbolt was still engaged when I'd turned my key. The windows were sealed shut, painted over years ago by a landlord too cheap to maintain them properly. Yet there it was, placed with surgical precision in the center of my pillow, as if someone had measured to ensure perfect placement. "You're starting to understand," it read. "The space between what's real and what isn't. I live there now, so do you." I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I sat in my living room chair with a baseball bat across my knees, watching the door and listening for sounds that never came. My reflection in the dark window looked haggard, almost unrecognizable. The fluorescent lights at work seemed to follow me home, that same insectile humming filling my apartment, even though I knew it was impossible. By Friday, I was beginning to question my own sanity. The rational part of my mind suggested explanations. Stress-induced hallucinations, a breakdown brought on by isolation and fear. Maybe I was writing the notes myself, in some fugue state I couldn't remember. Maybe Harold Vance had never existed at all, was just a composite of fears given form by an exhausted brain. But then I found the lighter. It was sitting on my kitchen counter Saturday morning, the same blue Bic I had sold to him nearly 2 weeks earlier. I knew it was the same one because of a small scratch along the side, a mark I'd noticed when I'd pulled it from the display case. The lighter was warm to the touch, as if someone had been using it recently. When I flicked the wheel, it produced a flame, but the fire burned the wrong color. Too blue, too cold, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I set it down carefully, as if it might explode, and backed away. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward with each breath I took. The humming sound was back, louder now, emanating not from any light fixture but from the lighter itself. That's when I realized the truth, or what felt like truth in that moment of crystalline terror. Harold Vance hadn't left notes or broken into my apartment. He hadn't been following me or watching from the shadows. The killer was gone, had probably been arrested or moved on to other hunting grounds days ago. But something else had taken notice of our brief encounter. Something that lived in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between sleeping and waking. Something that fed on the fear of recognition, the horror of knowing you had stood face to face with evil and done nothing to stop it. The lighter sat on my counter, burning without being lit, casting impossible shadows on the walls. And in those shadows, I could see the outline of a man who wasn't quite there, whose empty eyes watched me with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. I understand now why he needed the lighter. Not to light cigarettes or start fires, but to mark the moment when our paths crossed, to create a connection that would outlast his physical presence. The flame was a beacon, calling to whatever comes after, whatever feeds on the guilt and terror of witnesses who remain silent. The news reports stopped mentioning Harold Vance after a week. No new abductions, no sightings. It was as if he had simply vanished from the world, leaving only questions and the lingering smell of gasoline and decay. But the lighter remains, burning its cold fire on my kitchen counter. And sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when the fluorescent humming is loudest, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A figure standing just outside the range of certainty, waiting with infinite patience for me to finally acknowledge what I know to be true. I sold a killer a lighter, and now, in the space between what is real and what cannot be real, something has come to collect the debt. The flame burns on, casting shadows that shouldn't exist, and I find myself wondering, when the lighter finally runs out of fuel, what will happen to the darkness it has been holding back? I suppose I'll find out soon enough. The flame grows smaller each day, and the shadows grow longer. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, between sanity and madness, Harold Vance's empty eyes continue to watch, waiting for the moment when the light finally dies and the real darkness can begin. Story 6. The neon sign buzzed with electric persistence, casting its orange glow across the empty parking lot like a beacon for the desperate and the sleepless. Brew and go. 24 hours it promised, though at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, I seemed to be the only one taking it up on that offer. My headlights swept across the storefront as I pulled into a spot directly in front of the main entrance, the beams revealing floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed warmly from within. Everything looked normal from the outside. Too normal, maybe. I sat in my car for a moment, engine still running, letting the familiar hum of the heater wash over me. The drive from Denver had been longer than expected, and caffeine wasn't just a want anymore. It was a biological necessity if I planned to make it to Salt Lake City before sunrise. My eyelids felt like sandpaper, and that dangerous microsleep had started creeping in during the last 30 miles. The coffee shop's interior blazed with fluorescent life. I could see the familiar layout through the windows, the curved counter, the menu boards suspended from the ceiling, the neat rows of merchandise lining the walls. Steam rose from what must have been the espresso machine, and I caught the subtle flicker of heat shimmer from the warming ovens. The place was clearly operational, humming with all the mechanical heartbeats of a functioning business. But there wasn't a single person visible anywhere inside. I turned off the engine and stepped into the cold Wyoming air. The silence hit me immediately, not just the absence of traffic or voices, but something deeper. Even the usual night sounds seemed muffled, as if the darkness itself were holding its breath. My footsteps on the asphalt sounded unnaturally loud, each step echoing off the empty buildings that lined this stretch of highway. The entrance doors were the automatic kind, and they slid open with a mechanical whisper as I approached. A wave of warm air rushed out to meet me, carrying the rich scent of roasted coffee beans and something else. Something sweeter, almost medicinal. The familiar chime announced my arrival to no one. I stepped inside and waited, and the overhead speakers played some generic acoustic guitar melody at low volume, the kind of background music designed to be barely noticed. The registers sat silent and dark, their screens reflecting the fluorescent lights in fractured patterns. Behind the counter, the espresso machine continued its quiet work, occasionally releasing small puffs of steam like mechanical sighs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice feeling strange in the empty space. The words seemed to get absorbed by the walls, leaving no echo, no response. I walked deeper into the store, my sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floors. The merchandise displays stood in perfect order, bags of coffee beans arranged by roast level, travel mugs sorted by size, packages of pastries lined up behind glass doors. Everything was precisely where it should be, as if someone had just finished organizing it all. The warming ovens hummed behind the counter, their digital displays showing optimal temperatures. Fresh baked goods sat under heat lamps, looking like they'd been placed there within the hour. Banana bread, croissants, breakfast sandwiches wrapped in paper, all waiting for customers who weren't there. I approached the counter, my hands already reaching for my wallet out of habit. That's when I noticed the order display screen mounted on the wall behind the registers. It was one of those digital boards that showed pending orders, usually displaying things like large latte, Sarah, or medium dark roast, Mike. But this screen showed something else entirely. In clean white letters against a black background, it read, "Large black coffee, Marcus Hoffman." My full name, my exact coffee preference. I stared at the screen, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. I hadn't spoken to anyone. I hadn't even touched the ordering kiosk that stood to my left, its screen still showing the main menu in all its colorful, untouched glory. I pulled out my phone to check if maybe I'd somehow placed a mobile order and forgotten about it. The screen showed no recent app activity, no order confirmations in my email. Nothing. The display board flickered once, the letters scrambling for just a moment before reforming. Large black coffee, Marcus Hoffman. Is someone back there? I called louder this time, leaning slightly over the counter to peer into the prep area. I could see the industrial coffee makers, their glass carafes full and steaming, the cream dispensers, the syrup pumps, the cash registers, all waiting. But no people. A soft mechanical whir drew my attention to my left. The ordering kiosk's screen had changed. Instead of the main menu, it now displayed a simple message. "Thank you for your order, Marcus. Please wait while we prepare your beverage." I definitely hadn't touched it. My hand trembled slightly as I reached toward the screen. The moment my finger made contact with the glass, it went dark for several seconds, then flashed back to life, showing the main menu again. As if nothing had happened, the coffee smell was getting stronger now, tinged with that sweet, almost chemical undertone I'd noticed when I first walked in. It reminded me of something medical, like the disinfectant they used in hospitals, but warmer, more organic. Behind the counter, I heard the distinct sound of a coffee cup being placed on a surface. Then another, the soft clink of ceramic against metal. I couldn't see anyone, but someone was definitely working back there. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying a slight tremor now. "I can hear you. Could you please come out? I just want to order a coffee." The sound stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant, like the pause before thunder. I waited, counting heartbeats. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with their characteristic electrical whine. The espresso machine released another small cloud of steam. The acoustic guitar in the speakers completed its melody and started over from the beginning. Then, from somewhere in the back prep area, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The sound of someone walking across a hard floor in soft-soled shoes. But still, no one appeared. The footsteps stopped, and I heard what sounded like liquid being poured. The rich glug of coffee hitting the bottom of a cup, then the pitch changing as the cup filled. It was a sound I'd heard thousands of times, but here in this empty place, it took on an ominous quality. "Large black coffee for Marcus," a voice called from the back. The voice was perfectly normal, friendly, professional, neither male nor female. The kind of voice you'd expect from any coffee shop employee anywhere in America. Except I still couldn't see who had spoken. A cup appeared on the pickup counter. Just appeared. One moment the surface was empty. The next moment there was a large coffee cup sitting there, steam rising from the small opening in its plastic lid. I approached slowly, my heart rate climbing with each step. The cup was exactly what I'd ordered. What I'd somehow ordered without actually ordering anything. Large black coffee in a standard to-go cup with the Brew and Go logo printed on the side. As I reached for it, I noticed something else on the counter beside the cup. A receipt. I picked it up with shaking fingers. The thermal paper was still warm from printing. At the top, it showed the standard receipt header, store location, date, time. The timestamp read 3:24 a.m. Exactly the right time. Below that, the itemized order, large black coffee, 2.49s. At the bottom, in the space usually reserved for the cashier's name, it simply said, "Served by Recognition." Not Rebecca or Robert or any normal name. Recognition. I looked up at the security cameras mounted in the corners of the ceiling. Their little red lights blinked steadily, recording everything. But recording what exactly? A man standing alone in an empty coffee shop talking to no one, picking up a cup that had materialized out of thin air. The thought hit me like ice water. What if I was the only one who couldn't see the employees? What if they were standing right there, looking at me with concern, wondering why I seemed so confused and frightened? What if the problem wasn't with the store, but with me? I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, holding it up to film the area behind the counter. Through the screen, I could see everything exactly as my eyes saw it. Empty prep stations, unmanned equipment, no people anywhere. But as I watched, something moved in the reflection on the espresso machine's chrome surface. A dark shape, human-sized, moving from left to right behind where I was standing. I spun around. Nothing. The store stretched out behind me, empty and unchanged. When I looked back at my phone screen, the reflection was gone. I set the device down and picked up the coffee cup with both hands. It was hot, almost too hot to hold, and the coffee inside smelled perfect, rich and dark and exactly the way I liked it. I lifted the cup to my lips and took a careful sip. It was good. Really good. Better than most coffee I'd had from places with actual visible staff. The warmth spread through my chest, and for a moment the strangeness of the situation seemed to recede. Maybe this was just some new automated system I wasn't familiar with. Maybe the employees were in a back room, monitoring everything through cameras, operating the machinery remotely. Maybe this was the future of fast food. Invisible, efficient, impersonal. But then I noticed the receipt in my hand was changing. The text remained the same, but below the original printing, new words were appearing. Not printed, but written in what looked like pencil, the letters forming themselves as I watched. "Thank you for visiting us, Marcus. We've been waiting for you." The pencil writing continued, line by line, as if an invisible hand were writing directly on the paper. "You're tired. You've been driving for a long time. You need rest." My hands were shaking now, making the receipt flutter. "There's a room upstairs. Clean sheets. No charge. You can continue your journey tomorrow." The writing stopped. I looked around the coffee shop again, searching for any sign of stairs, any indication that there was an upstairs at all. The ceiling looked standard, drop tiles with fluorescent fixtures. No indication of another floor above. But when I looked more carefully at the back wall, past the counter and prep areas, I could see what might have been a door. It was partially hidden behind a rack of promotional materials, but there was definitely something there. The coffee cup in my hands was getting uncomfortably hot. When I tried to set it down on the nearest table, I found that it seemed stuck to my palms. Not physically stuck, but every time I attempted to release it, my fingers wouldn't respond. As if my nervous system had decided that letting go simply wasn't an option. The receipt was still in my other hand, and more writing was appearing. "Don't be afraid, Marcus. We know what you need. We've always known." The fluorescent lights overhead began to flicker, just slightly. Not enough to plunge the place into darkness, but enough to create a strobe effect that made everything seem to move when it shouldn't. The merchandise displays appeared to shift and sway. The menu boards swayed on their chains. "We've been preparing for your arrival." I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if I were trying to move through deep water. The coffee smell was overwhelming now, mixed with that sweet chemical scent that seemed to be getting stronger by the minute. It was making me dizzy. "You can't leave yet, Marcus. You haven't finished your coffee." I looked down at the cup in my hands. It was still full, despite the fact that I was sure I'd taken several sips. The surface of the coffee was perfectly still, reflecting the flickering lights like a dark mirror. In that reflection, I saw my own face looking back up at me. But something was wrong with it. My eyes in the reflection were completely black, as if the pupils had expanded to fill the entire socket. And I was smiling a smile I definitely wasn't making. I jerked the cup away from my face, and the coffee sloshed violently inside. When I looked again, it was just coffee. No reflection, no black eyes, no smile. The receipt was still writing itself. "You're so tired, Marcus. You've been driving for days, weeks. Do you even remember when you started this trip?" I tried to think. I'd left Denver. When? This morning? Yesterday morning? The timeline felt slippery in my mind, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. "You've been driving in circles. The same highway, the same exits, the same destinations that never arrive. Don't you recognize this place?" I looked around the coffee shop again, trying to focus through the growing dizziness. The layout, the color scheme, the arrangement of tables and chairs, it all seemed familiar. But not familiar like a chain restaurant where every location looks the same. Familiar like a specific place I'd been before. "You've stopped here before, Marcus. Many times. Always at 3:17 a.m. Always ordering the same thing. Always asking the same questions." The cup was burning my hands now, but I still couldn't seem to let go of it. The coffee inside had started to bubble slightly, as if it were boiling. always ending up in the same room upstairs. I forced myself to look toward the back wall again. The door I'd glimpsed earlier was clearly visible now, painted the same color as the walls, but definitely there. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see wooden stairs leading up into darkness. You never remember checking out, do you, Marcus? You never remember leaving. You just wake up in your car in the parking lot at 3:17 a.m. needing coffee. The receipt was almost completely covered in writing now, the original transaction details nearly obscured by the penciled words that continued to appear. But you always come back inside. You always order the same thing. You always end up in the same room. The fluorescent lights flickered more intensely, and in the strobing illumination, I caught glimpses of movement throughout the store. Shadows that shouldn't exist. Shapes that were there one moment and gone the next. Behind the counter, in the corners, reflected in the windows. Always just at the edge of vision. Always just out of focus. The room is ready for you, Marcus. It's always ready. I tried to drop the cup, tried to throw it, tried to crush it in my hands. Nothing worked. It remained perfectly intact, perfectly hot, perfectly stuck to my palms. The coffee inside continued to bubble, sending up streams of vapor that smelled less and less like coffee, and more like that sweet chemical scent. You can fight it if you want. You always do. But you always end up going upstairs. My vision was starting to blur around the edges. The store seemed to be slowly rotating around me, or maybe I was rotating, and everything else was standing still. The distinction no longer seemed important. Because deep down you know the truth, don't you, Marcus? I could hear footsteps again, but this time they seemed to be coming from all directions. The soft sound of shoes on hard floors getting closer and closer, though I still couldn't see anyone. You've been here for a very long time. The receipt in my hand was completely black now, covered in layer upon layer of writing that spiraled from the edges toward the center. The words were getting smaller and smaller, cramming themselves into the remaining white space. And you're never going to leave. The door at the back of the store swung open with a long, slow creak. The stairs beyond were no longer dark. They were lit by the same fluorescent glow as the rest of the store, ascending into what looked like an ordinary hallway. I found myself walking toward it. Not by choice, but not against my will either. It was more like remembering to do something I'd always intended to do, like coming home after a long trip. The coffee cup came with me, still burning my hands, still impossible to release. With each step, the store around me seemed to fade slightly, becoming less solid, less real. By the time I reached the door, I could barely feel the floor beneath my feet. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the enclosed space. At the top, a hallway stretched out in both directions lined with doors. All the doors were closed except one, about halfway down on the left. Room 237. The number meant nothing to me, but seeing it filled me with a sense of coming home that was both comforting and terrifying. The door was open just wide enough for me to see inside. A bed with white sheets, turned down and waiting. A window that looked out onto the parking lot below, where my car sat under the neon sign. Where my car had always sat. I walked to the window and looked down. In the driver's seat, I could see a figure slumped forward against the steering wheel. Male, wearing the same clothes I was wearing. Dark hair, same build, the same face, visible in profile in the orange glow of the neon sign. The coffee cup finally released from my hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud. When I looked down, it was empty, though I couldn't remember drinking from it. On the bed, someone had left a fresh receipt. This one was handwritten from the start, in the same pencil marks I'd seen downstairs. Welcome back, Marcus. Sleep well. Your car will be ready for you at 3:17 a.m. I sat on the edge of the bed, my body moving without conscious direction. The sheets were cool and soft, exactly the way I preferred them. Outside the window, the neon sign continued its electric buzz, casting the same orange glow across the same empty parking lot. The figure in my car hadn't moved. I lay back against the pillows and closed my eyes. The sweet chemical smell was fainter up here, replaced by something cleaner. Laundry detergent and fresh air. As sleep began to pull me under, I heard the faint sound of an engine starting in the parking lot below, then the crunch of tires on gravel, growing fainter as the vehicle pulled back onto the highway. Heading toward Salt Lake City, maybe, or Denver, or anywhere else that was always just a little too far away. The last thing I heard before sleep claimed me completely was the familiar ding of the coffee shop's entrance door opening downstairs, followed by footsteps on the polished floor. And then, from somewhere far below, a voice calling out into the fluorescent-lit emptiness. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Story 7. The headlights cut through darkness thick as black velvet, revealing nothing but endless asphalt stretching toward a horizon that seemed to swallow light itself. Highway 49 had always been desolate after midnight, but tonight felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air carried weight I couldn't name. The radio had died 20 miles back, dissolving into static that sounded almost like whispers before falling silent completely. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, pushing through fatigue that made my eyelids feel lined with sandpaper. The conference in Sacramento had run late, and I'd foolishly decided to drive home rather than spend another night in a sterile hotel room. Now, with my fuel gauge hovering dangerously close to empty and no gas stations in sight, that decision felt increasingly like a mistake. The steering wheel beneath my palms had grown slick with perspiration, despite the October chill seeping through the car's weather stripping. Something about this stretch of highway felt wrong. Not just empty, but actively hostile, as if the darkness itself resented my intrusion. Mile markers flashed by like pale tombstones, their reflective surfaces catching my headlights for brief moments before disappearing back into the void. That's when I saw the lights. Red and blue strobes pierced the darkness behind me, growing larger in my rearview mirror with each passing second. Relief flooded through me initially. Finally, another human being in this god-forsaken stretch of nowhere. But as the patrol car closed the distance, something nagged at the edges of my consciousness, a wrongness I couldn't quite identify. The siren's wail never came. The lights flashed in perfect silence, creating an eerie disco effect against the surrounding pine trees. I slowed, pulling toward the shoulder as gravel crunched beneath my tires. The patrol car followed, its headlights flooding my interior with harsh white light that made everything look bleached and unnatural. I rolled down my window, expecting the familiar routine of license and registration. Cool air rushed in, carrying scents that made no sense, sulfur mixed with something metallic and burnt, like overheated machinery. The smell triggered something primal in my brain, a fight-or-flight response that made my heart rate spike uncomfortably. Footsteps approached on gravel, slow and deliberate. Too deliberate, I realized. Each step fell with mechanical precision, as if the walker was consciously thinking about the act of walking. Through my side mirror, I caught glimpses of a figure in what appeared to be a standard police uniform, but the details seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them. When he reached my window, I turned to face him directly, and the wrongness hit me like a physical blow. The man, if it was a man, wore a police uniform that looked authentic enough, complete with badge and utility belt. But his face existed in a kind of uncanny valley that made my skin crawl. Features that should have been familiar, eyes, nose, mouth, seemed arranged correctly but felt fundamentally wrong, like a photograph slightly out of focus. His voice, when it came, sounded like it was being filtered through old radio equipment. "Evening, sir. I need you to step out of the vehicle." No request for documentation, no explanation for the stop. Just a command delivered in tones that seemed to come from somewhere behind his throat rather than from it. I found myself reaching for the door handle before my rational mind reasserted control. "Is there a problem, officer?" I managed, proud that my voice remained steady despite the growing sense of unreality. He tilted his head at an angle that was just slightly too far to be natural. I said, "Step out of the vehicle. We have procedures to follow." It was then that I noticed his patrol car in my rearview mirror. The red and blue lights continued their silent dance, but something was missing. The car cast no reflection on the wet asphalt, as if it existed in a different dimension than the rain-slicked road beneath it. More troubling still, I couldn't make out any license plates, front or back. The spaces where they should have been remained dark voids. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I'd like to see some identification first, if you don't mind." The thing wearing the police uniform straightened, and for a moment, the illusion of humanity slipped. His proportions seemed wrong, arms too long, shoulders too broad, as if someone had stretched a photograph without maintaining proper ratios. The smell of sulfur grew stronger, now mixed with what I recognized as burning motor oil. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated, and this time his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. "You will recite the oath." "What oath?" The question escaped before I could stop it. For the first time, something like expression crossed his face, a smile that revealed teeth arranged in perfect rows, too white and too sharp. "The oath of passage. It must be spoken in the old tongue." He began to recite something in what sounded like Latin, though the words carried inflections I'd never heard before. The syllables seemed to crawl across my skin like insects, raising goosebumps along my arms and neck. Each phrase felt heavy with meaning I couldn't grasp, but instinctively feared. "I'm not repeating anything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The admission seemed to hang in the air between us like a challenge. The temperature around my car plummeted suddenly, turning my breath visible in small puffs that fogged the windshield. The strobing lights behind me began to flicker erratically, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of their source. The thing outside my window grew perfectly still, as if someone had pressed a pause button on reality itself. Then it began to dissolve. Not all at once, but gradually, like sugar stirring into coffee. The edges of his uniform started to fray into wisps of gray mist that curled upward despite the lack of any breeze. His face became indistinct, features blurring together until only the suggestion of eyes remained. 2 points of dim light floating in an increasingly formless mass. The smell intensified to the point where I had to cover my nose with my shirt. Sulfur and burning oil mixed with something else, something organic and rotten that made my stomach lurch. The mist that had been the police officer began to take on a life of its own, flowing around my car like fog seeking entry through every crack and crevice. I fumbled for the window button, my fingers clumsy with terror and adrenaline. The glass rose with agonizing slowness as tendrils of mist reached toward the narrowing gap. Just before the window sealed completely, I heard something that might have been laughter, a sound like steam escaping from a broken radiator. The patrol car's lights went out all at once, plunging the highway back into absolute darkness. When my eyes adjusted, there was nothing behind me. No car, no lights, no sign that anything had ever been there except for the lingering smell that seemed to cling to the inside of my nostrils. I sat in the silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to process what had just happened. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, only to find the screen completely black. Not dead, black, as if the device had forgotten how to display anything at all. Starting the engine required 3 attempts, my foot pumping the gas pedal with increasing desperation. When it finally caught, the sound was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I pulled back onto the highway, checking my mirrors obsessively for any sign of pursuit. The next gas station appeared after another 15 miles, its fluorescent lights creating an oasis of normalcy in the darkness. I pulled up to the pumps with trembling hands and stumbled inside, desperate for human contact and the reassurance that the world still operated according to familiar rules. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, looked up from her magazine with practiced disinterest. "Long night?" "You could say that." I approached the counter, suddenly unsure how to explain what had happened. "Has anyone else reported strange police activity on Highway 49 tonight?" She frowned, studying my face with new attention. "Police activity? Honey, there hasn't been a patrol on that stretch in over 2 years. Budget cuts. We're lucky if we see a sheriff's deputy once a month." The words hit me like ice water. I stared at her, searching for signs that she was joking or mistaken. Her expression remained concerned but confused, the look of someone confronting an obvious truth being questioned. "That's impossible," I whispered. "I was just stopped by..." "By who?" Her voice had taken on a careful tone, the way people speak to someone they're beginning to worry about. "Sir, are you feeling all right? You look pretty shaken up." I realized how I must appear. Pale, sweating, probably wild-eyed. The rational part of my mind began offering explanations. Fatigue, highway hypnosis, micro-sleep episodes that could create vivid hallucinations. I'd been driving for hours, running on caffeine and determination. It wouldn't be the first time an exhausted driver had experienced something that seemed real but wasn't. But the smell still lingered in my nostrils, faint but unmistakable. "Yeah," I said finally, backing toward the door. "Just tired, long drive." I returned to my car and sat in the driver's seat for another 10 minutes, trying to reconcile what I'd experienced with the clerk's words. No police patrols on Highway 49, not for 2 years. The logical explanation was obvious. I'd hallucinated the entire encounter, my overtired brain creating a vivid waking dream. Except hallucinations didn't usually leave physical evidence. I reached into my glove compartment for a tissue and found something that made my blood freeze. Tucked between my registration and insurance papers was a small card, cream-colored and expensive-looking. Embossed in elegant script were words in what looked like Latin, followed by English translation: "Qui non jurat in tenebris mane." "Those who do not swear remain in darkness." Below that, in smaller print: "Second notice. Final warning to follow." I dropped the card as if it had burned me, watching it flutter to the passenger side floor. My hands shook as I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had left that message. The drive home passed in a blur of paranoid checking of mirrors and radio scanning for any mention of unusual incidents on Highway 49. Nothing. The world continued to operate as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't encountered something that shouldn't exist. 3 days later, I convinced myself it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. The card could have been planted by someone playing an elaborate prank, though I couldn't imagine who or why. The smell might have been a real mechanical problem with my car that I'd unconsciously incorporated into the fantasy. Memory was unreliable, especially under stress and fatigue. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself avoiding Highway 49. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I smell sulfur and burning oil drifting through my bedroom window. On those nights, I find myself wondering what would have happened if I'd recited that oath. What door might have opened, or what door might have closed. Most troubling of all, I've begun to research Latin phrases online, driven by a compulsion I don't understand. The words from that night replay in my memory with perfect clarity, despite my usual inability to remember foreign languages. Sometimes I catch myself mouthing the syllables, feeling them roll around my tongue like they belong there. I haven't spoken them aloud yet. Some instinct stronger than curiosity keeps me silent. But the urge grows stronger each day, and I find myself wondering how much longer I can resist. The card mentioned a final warning, and I can't shake the feeling that my time for choosing is running out. Whatever stopped me on Highway 49 that night, it's not finished with me yet. And deep down, in a place I don't like to examine too closely, I suspect I'm not finished with it either. The only question is whether what happened to me was real, or whether I'm slowly losing my mind. I'm no longer sure which possibility frightens me more. Story 8. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, 23 years after I'd last spoken to Marcus. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, with my name written in that careful script I remembered from our shared childhood, the kind of penmanship that spoke of private tutors and old money. Inside, the message was brief. Dinner at 8, this Friday. The address was the same Victorian house on Elm Street where we'd spent countless afternoons as boys, where Marcus had whispered about things that danced in corners and breathed behind walls. I almost threw the invitation away. Instead, I found myself standing before that familiar wrought iron gate as autumn darkness settled over the neighborhood. The house loomed exactly as I remembered, 3 stories of weathered brick and timber, with bay windows that caught the street light like watching eyes. The front garden had grown wild, ivy crawling up the walls in thick, searching tendrils that seemed to pulse in the evening breeze. Marcus answered the door before I could knock, as if he'd been waiting behind the heavy oak panels. Time had carved lines around his eyes and threaded silver through his dark hair, but his smile remained unchanged. Too wide, too knowing, with something lurking behind it that had always made my skin crawl. He led me through hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes tracking our movement. The house smelled of old wood and something else, something sharp and acrid that made my nostrils burn. We settled in the dining room, where candles cast writhing shadows across burgundy wallpaper that seemed to shift and breathe in the flickering light. Marcus poured wine from a bottle that looked older than both of us combined, the liquid dark as blood in our glasses. He spoke of his work in rare books, his recent travels through Eastern Europe, his decision to return to the family home after his parents' passing. I nodded and made appropriate sounds, but my attention kept drifting to the corners of the room, where shadows gathered too thick for the available light. It was during the second course that I noticed the first flicker, a brief orange glow in the far corner, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. I blinked, refocused, but saw only wallpaper and shadow. Marcus continued talking about a manuscript he'd acquired in Prague, his voice steady and unremarkable, but I caught him glancing toward the same corner with an expression I couldn't quite read. The dining room felt smaller than I remembered, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. The candle flames seemed to lean inward, as if drawn by some invisible force. I took another sip of wine, hoping the alcohol would steady my nerves, but instead found my hands trembling slightly as I set the glass down. Marcus excused himself to check on the main course, leaving me alone with the watching portraits and the gathering darkness beyond the windows. In his absence, the room felt different, charged, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and I could swear I heard something moving behind the walls. A soft scratching that might have been mice, or might have been something else entirely. When he returned carrying a steaming platter, the temperature in the room had dropped noticeably. My breath came in small puffs and goosebumps rose along my arms beneath my jacket. Marcus seemed unaffected by the cold, serving the roast with steady hands while continuing his monologue about manuscripts and medieval binding techniques. It was then that the kitchen door swung open of its own accord. We both turned toward the sound, and I saw Marcus's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He excused himself again, moving toward the kitchen with quick, purposeful steps. I heard the clatter of pots, the squeak of cabinet doors, the hiss of gas being adjusted. When he returned, his face had gone pale beneath the candlelight. The conversation resumed, but something had shifted. Marcus spoke faster now, his words tumbling over each other as if he were trying to fill some void with sound. He told me about the restoration work he'd been doing, how he'd found strange marks behind the old wallpaper, scorch patterns that made no sense, char marks in places where no fire had ever burned. As he spoke, I became aware of a sound beneath his voice, a low humming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, a vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. The candle flames began to dance more violently, casting wild shadows that writhed across the walls like living things. Marcus's voice grew distant, muffled, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. The humming grew louder, rising in pitch until it became a whine that made my ears ring. The temperature continued to drop, and now I could see my breath clearly, white puffs that dissipated into the strange, thick air. That's when I saw the second flicker. This time it lasted longer, a tongue of orange flame licking up from the baseboards behind Marcus's chair. He didn't seem to notice, continuing his story about finding old photographs hidden in the attic, images of rooms filled with smoke and people running in panic. The flame grew brighter, more defined, casting its own light that didn't quite blend with the candle glow. I opened my mouth to warn him, but no sound came out. My throat felt constricted, as if invisible hands were pressing against my windpipe. The flame spread along the wall but left no mark, created no heat, cast no smoke. It simply existed, impossible and beautiful and wrong. Marcus finally noticed my stare and turned to follow my gaze. For a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something in his eyes. Fear, yes, but also recognition, acceptance, perhaps even relief. He turned back to me with that too-wide smile and suggested we move to the kitchen for coffee. The kitchen was worse. Here, the humming was louder, a deep thrumming that seemed to originate from somewhere beneath the floorboards. The air shimmered with heat despite the persistent cold, and shadows moved independently of their sources. Marcus busied himself with the coffee preparation, his movements mechanical, precise, while I stood frozen in the doorway. The gas stove dominated one wall, its surface reflecting the overhead lights in ways that hurt to look at directly. As Marcus filled the kettle, I noticed the burner grates seemed to glow with their own inner light, pulsing in rhythm with the humming from below. The cabinet doors rattled softly, as if something inside were trying to get out. Marcus turned the gas dial, and the familiar click-click-click of the igniter filled the air. But instead of the usual blue flame, the burner erupted in brilliant orange fire that roared upward like a living thing. Marcus jumped back, his face illuminated by the impossible blaze, and for a moment I saw him as he truly was. Not the composed adult he'd become, but the frightened boy I'd known. The one who used to whisper about fires that burned without fuel and flames that appeared where no flame should be. The fire died as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the burner cold and dark. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, then quietly turned off the gas and suggested we return to the dining room. But I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot, my entire body paralyzed by the certainty that something fundamental had shifted in the world around me. The kitchen felt alive now, breathing, waiting. Every surface seemed to pulse with hidden energy. Every shadow harbored potential flame. Marcus took my arm with gentle insistence, guiding me back through the house. The hallways seemed longer than before, the portraits more numerous, their painted eyes tracking our passage with increasing intensity. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet in rhythms that didn't match our steps, and somewhere in the walls that scratching sound had returned. Louder now, more urgent. We settled back into the dining room, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The air felt thick, oppressive, charged with an electricity that made my skin crawl and my hair stand on end. The candles burned lower now, their wax pooling in strange patterns that reminded me of arcane symbols from half-remembered nightmares. Marcus poured more wine with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. He began to speak again, but his words seemed to come from very far away, distorted by the humming that now filled the entire house. He told me about the dreams he'd been having since returning to this place. Dreams of fire and smoke, of rooms filled with flame that burned but never consumed, of voices calling from behind walls that had no doors. As he spoke, the flames returned. They appeared first in the corners again, small licks of orange light that seemed to seep from the wallpaper itself. Then along the baseboards, climbing the walls in slow, deliberate patterns that defied physics and reason. The fires cast no heat, produced no smoke, left no mark, but their light was real, bright enough to make the candles seem dim by comparison. Marcus's voice faded to a whisper, then to silence. We sat watching the impossible flames dance around us, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking. The fires grew brighter, more numerous, until the entire room seemed to burn with cold light that hurt to look at directly. That's when I understood. The realization hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and sending ice through my veins. These weren't hallucinations or tricks of the light or signs of impending madness. They were memories. The house was remembering every fire that had ever burned within its walls, every candle, every hearth, every gas flame, every electrical spark. And somehow, impossibly, it was sharing those memories with anyone sensitive enough to see them. Marcus had always been sensitive. As a boy, he'd been the first to notice when the shadows moved wrong, when the temperature dropped for no reason, when the walls began to remember. He'd tried to tell the adults, but they'd dismissed his claims as childhood imagination. So he'd learned to live with it, to accept the house's strange gift as part of his reality. But now I was seeing it too, and that changed everything. The flames continued their impossible dance around us, growing brighter with each passing moment. I could see Marcus clearly in their light, and what I saw made my blood freeze. His eyes had gone completely black, not just the pupils, but the entirety of both eyes, as if they'd been filled with smoke. When he smiled, his teeth seemed too sharp, too numerous, and something moved behind them in the darkness of his mouth. I tried to stand, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The chair seemed to have grown around me, holding me in place with invisible bonds. The flames crept closer, their cold light washing over my skin like water, and I felt something fundamental beginning to change inside me. Marcus leaned forward, his impossible eyes reflecting the dancing fires. When he spoke, his voice carried the sound of crackling wood and rushing wind. He told me the truth then, the real truth about the house and the fires and the gift that ran in his family like a genetic curse. The flames weren't memories, they were warnings. The house could see the future as clearly as the past, could witness every fire that would ever burn within its walls. And tonight, in exactly 17 minutes, a gas leak in the basement would find a spark. I felt the knowledge settle into my mind like a physical weight. 17 minutes until the explosion that would level half the block. 17 minutes until flames that would be all too real, all too hot, all too final. The house had been trying to warn us all evening, showing us fire after fire, trying to communicate the danger in the only way it knew how. But why save us? Why reveal the future now, after decades of cryptic warnings and half-glimpsed flames? Marcus answered the question I hadn't spoken aloud. The house needed witnesses, he said. It needed people who could see the fires that hadn't happened yet, who could understand the warnings and act on them. His parents had possessed the gift but had ignored it, dismissing the visions as stress or aging or simple hallucination. They died in their sleep 2 months ago when a faulty space heater had filled their bedroom with carbon monoxide. The house had been grieving ever since. I felt something shift in my perception, a subtle realignment that made the world seem both clearer and more complex. The flames around us weren't frightening anymore. They were beautiful, necessary, a form of communication that transcended human language. I could see them all now, every fire that had ever burned in this house, every flame that ever would. They overlapped and intertwined, creating patterns of impossible complexity and stunning beauty. Marcus stood and moved toward the kitchen, his movements fluid and purposeful. I followed, no longer paralyzed, my body responding to some deeper instinct. In the kitchen, the gas stove had begun to glow again, but this time I could see beyond the surface to the danger beneath. The slow leak in the basement line, the buildup of gas in the confined space, the single spark from an old electrical junction that would ignite it all in exactly 14 minutes. Working together, we found the shut-off valve in the basement, turning off the gas supply with minutes to spare. The immediate danger passed, but the visions continued. I could see other fires now, future blazes in other houses, other buildings, other lives hanging in the balance. The gift had awakened in me fully, permanently, irreversibly. As we stood in the basement among the old foundation stones and the smell of earth and time, Marcus explained the real purpose of the evening. He'd been alone too long, carrying the burden of foresight without anyone to share it. The house had guided him to reach out to me, had somehow known that I possessed the latent ability to see what he saw. We climbed back to the main floor, leaving the basement and its now silent gas lines behind. The dining room still flickered with memory fires, but they seemed gentler now, less urgent. We sat again at the table, and Marcus poured fresh wine into our glasses. The liquid seemed to glow with its own inner light. He told me about the others, a scattered network of people like us, gifted or cursed with the ability to see fires that existed outside of normal time. Some had learned to suppress the visions, living normal lives while willfully blind to the dangers around them. Others had been driven mad by the constant assault of overlapping timelines and impossible flames. A few, like Marcus, had learned to work with the gift, using it to prevent disasters and save lives. The house settled around us with a sound like a deep sigh, its walls finally relaxing after hours of tension. The memory fires faded, gradually becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone entirely. In their absence, the dining room felt almost normal again, just an old house with old furniture and the lingering smell of wax and wine. But I knew I would never see normally again. The gift was mine now, for better or worse. I could feel it settling into my consciousness like sediment in still water, changing the fundamental nature of my perception. Already, I was beginning to see flickers at the edges of my vision, tiny flames that spoke of future dangers in distant places. Marcus raised his glass in a toast to new partnership, to shared burden, to the strange gift that made us both guardian and prisoner of time itself. I raised my own glass, feeling the weight of responsibility settling over me like a heavy coat. Outside, the night continued its normal progression toward dawn. Cars passed on the street, their headlights sweeping across the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Fire trucks responding to some emergency we might have prevented, if we'd been watching, if we'd known to look. But there would be other chances, other warnings, other fires to prevent. The house had given me more than sight. It had given me purpose. I would learn to read the flames as Marcus had, to understand their warnings and act on their guidance. Together, we would serve as sentinels against disasters that hadn't happened yet, guardians of futures that could still be changed. As we finished our wine and prepared to part ways, Marcus handed me a small leather journal filled with addresses and phone numbers, the network of others like us, spread across the country, each one watching their own corner of the world for signs of fires to come. I took the book with steady hands, feeling its weight like a sacred trust. The last memory fire appeared as I reached the front door, a small flame that danced briefly in the air before me. This one was different from the others, warmer, brighter, more personal. In its brief existence, I saw my own future, years of vigilance and purpose, nights spent watching for warnings that only we could see, lives saved by actions taken in response to fires that existed only in possibility. It was not the future I had expected when I accepted Marcus's invitation, but it was the future I would embrace. The gift had chosen me as much as I had chosen it, and there was strange comfort in that certainty. I stepped out into the night air, leaving the house and its impossible memories behind me. But I knew I would return, that this place would always be a refuge and a reminder of the moment my world had expanded beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. The flames were mine now, and I was theirs, bound together in a partnership that transcended the usual limitations of cause and effect. As I walked toward my car, I could see them flickering at the edges of reality, tiny warnings of dangers yet to come, promises of lives yet to be saved. The night felt full of possibility and terror in equal measure, and I walked forward into both without hesitation. Story 9. The fluorescent lights in Ward 7 hummed with a frequency that seemed to burrow into my skull, a constant electrical whine that had become the soundtrack to my deteriorating sanity. 3 months into my residency at Mercy General, I had learned to navigate the hospital's labyrinthine corridors in the dark, my feet finding their way through muscle memory, while my mind wandered to places it shouldn't go. Tonight felt different, though. The air carried a weight that pressed against my chest with each breath, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more substantial. The late shift at a hospital always had its peculiarities. The way sounds echoed differently in the empty halls, how the heating system's groans could sound almost human. But this was something else entirely. I had been making my rounds, checking on patients whose names blurred together in my exhaustion-addled mind. Mrs. Chen in 714 with her persistent cough that rattled like dice in a cup. Mr. Rodriguez in 718, whose diabetes kept him tethered to monitors that beeped in an irregular rhythm that made my heart skip. Room 720 remained empty, its door slightly ajar, revealing a slice of darkness that seemed to watch me as I passed. The coffee I'd grabbed from the nurse's station had gone cold hours ago, leaving a bitter taste that no amount of water could wash away. My father's condition had been weighing on me more heavily than usual, the cancer spreading through his lungs like ink through water, each breath a victory against an inevitability we both refused to acknowledge. He was 3 floors up in the critical care unit, sleeping under the mechanical rhythm of machines that kept him tethered to this world. I tried not to think about him during my shifts. Professional detachment, they called it in medical school. But tonight, as I walked through these halls that reeked of disinfectant and desperation, his face kept floating to the surface of my consciousness like a body in dark water. The overhead page system crackled to life, startling me from my thoughts. Dr. Martinez was needed in the emergency room, a code blue in the pediatric wing, the usual nocturnal symphony of a hospital that never slept. But underneath these familiar sounds, I began to notice something else. Footsteps that seemed to echo mine, always just a beat behind, stopping when I stopped, resuming when I moved. I paused outside room 722, pressing my stethoscope against Mrs. Patterson's chest to listen to her labored breathing. The pneumonia was winning its battle, despite our best efforts. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality that spoke of a body preparing to surrender. As I adjusted her oxygen mask, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his silhouette barely visible in the dim hallway lighting. He wore what appeared to be a hospital gown, though something about the way it hung on his frame seemed wrong, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. His hair was white as fresh snow, and his eyes, when I could make them out in the shadows, seemed to hold a depth that made my stomach clench. I finished with Mrs. Patterson and stepped into the hallway, but the man was gone. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, lit only by the emergency exit signs that cast everything in a sickly red glow. I stood there for a moment, listening to the hospital's nighttime breathing, the whisper of ventilation systems, the distant murmur of the nurse's station, the electronic heartbeats of 100 monitoring devices. My next patient was in room 728, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery. As I approached her door, I noticed the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. My breath didn't quite mist, but I could feel the chill seeping through my scrubs, settling into my bones like an ache. The woman was sleeping, her face peaceful in a way that made me wonder what dreams visited her in this place where sleep was often elusive. I was checking her chart when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, firm but not rough, pressing through the thin fabric of my coat with fingers that felt cold even through the material. I turned, expecting to see one of the night nurses, perhaps Dr. Chen making his own rounds. Instead, I found myself face to face with the elderly man I had glimpsed earlier. Up close, his features were sharper, more defined than they had appeared in the shadows. His skin had a waxy quality that reminded me uncomfortably of the cadavers we had studied in anatomy class, and his eyes held a clarity that seemed at odds with his apparent age. "Visit your father. Now." The words came out in a voice that sounded like paper being crumpled, dry and brittle. There was no preamble, no explanation, just a command delivered with an authority that bypassed my rational mind and went straight to some deeper part of my consciousness that recognized the urgency in his tone. I wanted to ask him who he was, how he knew about my father, why he was wandering the halls in what appeared to be a patient gown despite not appearing on any of my charts. But the words stuck in my throat like pieces of broken glass. Instead, I found myself nodding, my body moving before my mind could catch up. The elevator ride to the critical care unit felt eternal, the numbers climbing with agonizing slowness while my heart hammered against my ribs. The old man hadn't followed me, hadn't said anything else. He had simply watched me go with those 2 clear eyes before melting back into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. The CCU was quieter than usual, the nurse's station manned by only one person, Janet, a veteran who had been working nights since before I was born. She looked up as I approached, her expression curious. "Bit late for a family visit, isn't it, doctor?" I mumbled something about being in the area, about wanting to check his vitals myself. She nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen countless family members struggle with the helplessness that comes with watching a loved one fight battles they couldn't join. My father's room was at the end of the hall, 314, where the heating seemed to work less efficiently and the shadows gathered in pools that the overhead lighting couldn't quite dispel. I could hear the familiar rhythm of his breathing apparatus before I reached the door, the mechanical inhale and exhale that had become his body's pacemaker. But as I got closer, something was wrong. The sound was different, labored in a way that made my medical training kick into high alert. I quickened my pace, my soft-soled shoes silent on the polished floor. The room was darker than it should have been. The monitors that usually cast their green and blue glow across the walls were black, their screens reflecting nothing but the faint light from the hallway. The oxygen concentrator, the machine that had been keeping his compromised lungs functional, sat silent beside his bed. My father lay motionless, his chest barely moving, his face a pale mask in the darkness. The power cord to the oxygen machine lay coiled on the floor like a sleeping snake, disconnected from the wall outlet. A power failure, perhaps, or equipment malfunction. But even as my rational mind tried to process what had happened, my hands were already moving, plugging the machine back in, checking the connections, my training taking over while my conscious mind reeled. The machine hummed back to life with a sound that might have been the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The monitors flickered on, their displays painting the room in familiar colors. My father's oxygen saturation numbers climbed slowly back toward normal, and his breathing began to settle into the rhythm I knew by heart. I stood there in the dim room, watching the numbers on the screen, trying to calculate how long he had been without supplemental oxygen. Minutes, perhaps. Long enough to be dangerous, but not long enough to cause permanent damage. The timing felt impossibly precise, as if I had arrived at exactly the right moment, as if something had orchestrated this entire sequence of events. The old man's words echoed in my memory. Visit your father. Now. Not a suggestion, but a command. Not random, but specific. The certainty in his voice, the urgency that had bypassed every rational thought in my head and sent me running to this room at exactly the moment my father needed me most. I sank into the chair beside his bed, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. The rational explanation was simple enough. Equipment failure happened all the time in hospitals. Old buildings, overloaded circuits, machines that ran constantly until they gave up. The timing was coincidental, nothing more. I had happened to be in the building, had happened to decide to visit, had happened to arrive in time to prevent what could have been a tragedy. But the coincidences stacked on top of each other like cards in a house built on shifting sand. The old man who knew about my father, who had appeared in the hallway and disappeared just as quickly. The strange chill in the air, the way the shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. The feeling that I was being watched, guided, manipulated by forces I couldn't understand. My father stirred slightly, his eyes opening just enough to focus on my face. He tried to speak, but the oxygen mask muffled his words. I reached over and adjusted it slightly, careful not to disturb the flow. Just rest, I whispered, though I wasn't sure he could hear me over the sound of the machine that was keeping him alive. His eyes found mine, and for a moment I saw something there that made my blood freeze. Recognition, perhaps, but recognition of what? His lips moved beneath the mask, forming words I couldn't quite make out. I leaned closer, straining to understand. The man, he seemed to be saying. White hair. My heart stopped. I leaned closer, my ear nearly touching the mask. The man with white hair, he whispered, his voice barely audible even this close. He was here. He told me you were coming. The room seemed to tilt around me, gravity shifting until up and down became negotiable concepts. I pulled back, studying my father's face, looking for signs of confusion, medication-induced hallucinations, anything that could explain what he had just said. But his eyes were clear, clearer than they had been in weeks, alert and focused in a way that spoke of absolute certainty about what he had experienced. I turned to look at the doorway, half expecting to see the old man standing there, watching us with those two clear eyes. But the hall was empty, lit only by the emergency lighting that cast everything in that familiar red glow. When I turned back to my father, his eyes had closed again, his breathing settling back into the mechanical rhythm of sleep. The monitors showed stable vitals, normal oxygen saturation, everything exactly as it should be for a man fighting a battle he was slowly losing. I sat in that chair for the rest of the night, watching the numbers on the screens, listening to the sound of machines keeping my father alive, and trying to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of my mind insisted on logical explanations. Stress, exhaustion, the psychological pressure of watching a parent deteriorate slowly over months. Hospital environments were notorious for playing tricks on perception, especially during the vulnerable hours of the night shift when the boundary between waking and sleeping became blurred. But logic felt inadequate in the face of what I had experienced. The timing was too perfect, the old man's knowledge too specific, my father's confirmation too clear to dismiss as coincidence or hallucination. As dawn began to creep through the windows, painting the room in shades of gray and gold, I made my way back to the 7th floor to finish my rounds. The hallways seemed different now, less oppressive but somehow more charged, as if the building itself had shifted into a different frequency overnight. I stopped outside room 720, the empty room that had been vacant for weeks according to the charts. The door stood slightly ajar, just as it had been earlier. But now I could see something inside that made my breath catch in my throat. A hospital gown lay folded neatly on the bed, the kind patients wore during their stays. It was clean, pressed, as if it had been prepared for someone's arrival. But the bed showed no signs of having been slept in, and there was no patient assigned to this room. I pushed the door open wider, stepping inside despite every instinct telling me to walk away. The room smelled of disinfectant and something else, something like old paper or dried flowers. On the bedside table sat a small card, the kind hospitals used for patient information. I picked it up with trembling fingers, knowing what I would find before I read it. The name on the card was written in the same handwriting doctors learned to decipher during training, but it wasn't any handwriting I recognized. And the name itself made my vision blur around the edges. The card was blank except for one line. Room 314, oxygen failure, 3:17 a.m. I checked my watch. It was 3:45 a.m. The card fluttered from my fingers, landing on the floor like a white butterfly with broken wings. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, my wrists, my temples. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of routine tasks performed on autopilot while my mind struggled to process what I had experienced. Every shadow seemed potentially significant. Every reflection in the polished floors could be hiding something important. The feeling of being watched had intensified, but now it felt less threatening and more protective. By the time I signed out and headed home, exhaustion had settled into my bones like lead. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of white hair and clear eyes, of machines that breathed for those who couldn't, and of timing so precise it could only be called miraculous. I never saw the old man again during my remaining time at Mercy General, but sometimes during the darkest hours of the night shift, I would catch glimpses of white hair at the end of hallways, or hear footsteps that echoed mine with perfect timing. And always, there was the feeling that something was watching over the halls of that old hospital, ensuring that miracles happened when they were needed most. My father recovered enough to go home for several more months before the cancer finally claimed him. But during those last months, he spoke often of visitors who came to see him, people with kind eyes and gentle voices who seemed to know exactly when he needed them most. The rational part of my mind still insists that stress and exhaustion can create remarkably convincing hallucinations, that hospitals are places where coincidences feel more significant than they actually are, and that the human mind is capable of finding patterns and meaning in the most random of events. But sometimes, in the deep hours of the night when the boundary between the possible and impossible grows thin, I allow myself to believe that there are guardians walking the halls of places where life and death dance their eternal dance. Guardians who know when a young doctor needs to visit his father, who understand the precise timing required for miracles, and who leave folded gowns and cryptic cards as evidence of their presence. Whether they exist in reality or only in the desperate hope of those who need to believe in something beyond the limitations of medicine and science, I cannot say. But I know that when I received that touch on my shoulder and that urgent command to visit my father, someone was watching over us both. And perhaps in the end, that is enough. Story 10. The dream came with the smell of lavender and decay. I found myself standing in my bedroom, yet not quite. The familiar space stretched wrong, walls breathing like lungs, shadows pooling in corners that shouldn't exist. The air hung thick with that peculiar weight dreams carry, where movement feels like swimming through honey. And there, beside my bed, stood the figure. She wore black from head to toe, a veil so dense it seemed to swallow light rather than merely block it. Her presence filled the room with an oppressive stillness, as if sound itself feared to disturb her vigil. I couldn't see her face through the dark fabric, but I felt her attention like ice water trickling down my spine. She stood perfectly motionless, hands folded at her waist, and though I couldn't see her eyes, I knew with dream certainty that she was watching me sleep. The lavender scent grew stronger, sickeningly sweet, mixing with something else. Something organic and wrong that made my throat constrict. I tried to move, to speak, to do anything but stand frozen in this twisted version of my own space, but my body refused to obey. The figure began to lean forward, slowly, deliberately, and the veil shifted just enough that I glimpsed something pale beneath. I jerked awake, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The digital clock's red numbers burned 3:17 a.m. into the darkness. Sweat cooled on my skin as reality reasserted itself. My actual bedroom, familiar and solid, no impossible angles or breathing walls. Just the normal collection of furniture I'd lived with for 3 years. The stack of unread books on the nightstand, the dirty laundry pile I kept meaning to deal with. Normal, safe. But the lavender smell lingered. I sat up, running my hands through my hair, trying to shake off the dream's residue. That's when my phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, making me jump so hard I nearly fell off the bed. Who calls at 3 in the morning? My first thought was work, some emergency at the office that couldn't wait until dawn. But the caller ID made my blood run cold. International number, Scotland. My finger hovered over the answer button. I had family in Scotland, my father's sister, Aunt Margaret, whom I'd met only twice in my 32 years. She was in her 70s now, living alone in some remote Highland village whose name I could never pronounce correctly. We exchanged Christmas cards and nothing else. Hello? My voice came out as a croak. The connection crackled with distance. A woman's voice, unfamiliar but professional, cut through the static. A nurse from some hospital with an unpronounceable name, calling about Margaret Sinclair. Was I the next of kin listed in her emergency contacts? The words hit me like physical blows. Stroke. Severe. Exactly at 3:17 a.m. local time. She was stable but unconscious, and they needed to know about any advance directives, any family who should be contacted. I heard myself responding with the right words, asking the right questions, but my mind was spinning. 3:17. The exact moment I'd awakened from that dream. The exact moment the figure in black had leaned forward, as if reaching for something. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, phone still clutched in my trembling hand. Coincidence? Had to be. Weird timing, sure, but nothing more than that. People have strange dreams all the time, and strokes happen to elderly people. The fact that these two events aligned was just one of those cosmic accidents that would make a good story someday. That's what I told myself as I got up to get a glass of water. That's when I saw the hair. It lay across my pillow like a silver thread, catching the light from the street lamp outside my window. A single strand, impossibly long and fine, the color of winter moonlight. I leaned closer and the scent hit me again. That same lavender fragrance from my dream, but now mixed with something else, something familiar. My aunt's perfume, L'Heure Bleue by Guerlain. I'd only smelled it twice in my life, both times when she'd visited us in Chicago during my childhood. But the scent was unmistakable, complex, and old-fashioned, the kind of fragrance that belonged to another era entirely. I picked up the hair with shaking fingers. It was real, solid, undeniably there. But how could it be? I lived alone, had for 3 years since Rebecca moved out. I changed my sheets religiously every Sunday, and today was Tuesday. No one had been in my bed but me. The rational explanations lined up like dominoes in my mind. Maybe it was from the previous tenant, somehow stuck in the mattress or pillowcase. Maybe it was from a visitor months ago that I'd forgotten about. Maybe it was actually one of my own hairs, just looking different in the strange light. But none of those explanations accounted for the perfume. I sealed the hair in a Ziploc bag. I'm not sure why. Some instinct told me to preserve it. And spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room with all the lights on, staring at that silver thread and trying to convince myself I was losing my mind. Dawn brought no relief, only a gray Chicago morning that matched my mood. I called in sick to work, something I never did, and spent the day researching flights to Scotland. The responsible thing would be to visit my aunt. I told myself, family duty. The fact that I was desperate to escape my own apartment had nothing to do with it. But as I scrolled through airline websites, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Nothing there when I turned to look, just the normal play of shadows and light through the windows. The heating system made its usual sounds, pipes expanding and contracting, but today every creak sounded like footsteps. Every settling timber was someone walking across my floor. I found myself checking the locks on my doors obsessively, even though I lived on the 4th floor, and the only access was through the building's secured entrance. I looked in all the closets, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. Nothing. No one. Just me and my growing certainty that I was being watched. The bag with the hair sat on my kitchen counter like an accusation. In daylight, it looked even more impossible. The strand was too long to be human, nearly 8 inches from end to end, and too fine. Under the kitchen fluorescence, it almost seemed to shimmer, as if it were made of spun glass rather than keratin. I tried to research my aunt's condition online, but the hospital's website was frustratingly vague, and my attempts to call back met with busy signals and endless hold music. Time zones were confusing me. I couldn't figure out whether I should be calling during their business hours or mine. My brain felt foggy, disconnected, as if I was still partially trapped in that strange dream. It was around noon when I noticed the smell again. Faint at first, just a whisper of lavender that made me think someone in the building was doing laundry with expensive detergent. But it grew stronger, more complex, until I could clearly identify the base notes of my aunt's perfume. I followed it through my apartment like a bloodhound, trying to locate the source. It was strongest in my bedroom. Standing in the doorway, I felt that same oppressive weight from my dream, as if the air itself had thickened. The smell seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, not from any specific object or surface, but from the space itself. I checked my sheets again, stripped the bed completely, but found nothing. No additional hairs, no stains, no logical explanation for the scent that now filled the room like fog. That's when I heard the whisper. So faint I almost missed it, like wind through dry leaves or paper brushing against paper. But there was no wind in my bedroom, no papers that could create such a sound. The whisper came again, and this time I could almost make out words. Not English, something else, maybe Gaelic. The sound seemed to come from right beside my ear, as if someone was standing close enough to breathe on my neck. I spun around, heart racing, but found only empty air and afternoon sunlight streaming through my windows. The whisper faded, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Even the city sounds from outside seemed muted, as if my apartment had been wrapped in cotton. I spent the next hour tearing my bedroom apart, looking for speakers, recording devices, anything that could explain what I'd heard. I found nothing but dust bunnies and a few coins that had rolled under the dresser. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was out. I could see her apartment was dark through the thin walls. The building was old enough that sounds carried, but not old enough for phantom voices to emerge from the walls themselves. By evening, I was questioning everything. Had I really heard whispers, or was my overtaxed mind creating audio hallucinations to match the visual ones? Was the perfume real, or was my brain somehow recreating the scent from memory, triggered by stress and lack of sleep? The hair in the bag looked real enough, but in the shifting light of sunset, even that seemed to change, sometimes appearing silver, sometimes almost transparent. I tried to eat dinner but couldn't taste anything. Food felt like cardboard in my mouth, and the simple act of chewing required enormous concentration. My hands shook when I reached for my water glass, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, certain I was being observed. The rational part of my mind, the part that held down a job, paid bills, maintained relationships, insisted this was all stress-induced delusion. Hearing about my aunt's stroke had triggered some kind of psychological episode, creating false sensory experiences that felt real but weren't. The hair was probably mine, the perfume a phantom scent, the whispers nothing more than blood rushing through my ears. But rationality felt thin and unconvincing in the face of what I was experiencing. Every instinct I possessed screamed that something was wrong, that my apartment had been invaded by a presence I couldn't see or understand. The very air felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. As night fell, I faced a terrible choice: stay in my apartment and confront whatever was happening, or flee to a hotel and admit that I was either losing my mind or running from something impossible. I chose to stay. I set up camp in my living room with every light blazing, my laptop open to a video call with my cousin in Portland. Distant family, but the only relative I could reach who might have more information about Aunt Margaret. She confirmed what the hospital had told me. Massive stroke, poor prognosis, but she was hanging on. The conversation felt surreal, discussing medical details while I sat surrounded by blazing lights, flinching at every shadow. Around midnight, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had opened a door to winter. My breath began to mist in the sudden cold, and frost started forming on the inside of my windows despite the building's heating system running full blast. The fluorescent bulbs flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. And then I saw her again. She stood in the hallway leading to my bedroom, exactly as she had appeared in my dream. The black veil hung motionless despite the air conditioning that had kicked on in response to the temperature drop. She was closer now, close enough that I could see the veil's fabric wasn't quite opaque. Something pale moved beneath it, shifting like smoke behind dark glass. My laptop screen went black. Not off, just black, as if something was blocking the camera. The silence was absolute now. Even the building's mechanical sounds had ceased. We regarded each other across my living room, if regard was the right word for whatever passed between us through that impenetrable veil. She raised one hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward my bedroom. I found myself standing, though I had no memory of deciding to move. My feet carried me forward against every instinct, past the figure who turned to follow my progress with movements too fluid to be human. The lavender scent was overwhelming now, mixing with that underlying decay until I could barely breathe. In my bedroom, everything had changed. The furniture remained the same, but the space felt larger, older, as if my walls had expanded to encompass some other room entirely. Moonlight streamed through windows that faced the wrong direction, casting everything in silver and shadow. And there, on my bed, lay an old woman. She wasn't dead. I could see the slight rise and fall of her chest, but she was unconscious, her face pale as parchment and slack with the aftermath of stroke. Tubes ran from her arms to machines that hummed softly in the corner, machines that definitely hadn't been there moments before. Her hair, white as fresh snow, spread across my pillow in exactly the pattern where I'd found that single strand. I knew, without question, that I was looking at my Aunt Margaret. The figure in black moved to stand beside the bed, one gloved hand resting on the unconscious woman's forehead. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like sound traveling through water. "She's calling for you." The words bypassed my ears entirely, appearing directly in my mind with the weight of absolute truth. I understood suddenly and completely that distance meant nothing, that the boundaries between Scotland and Chicago were illusions, that my aunt's spirit had somehow crossed an ocean to find the one family member who might understand. She doesn't want to be alone. I reached toward the bed, toward my aunt's motionless form, but my hand passed through empty air. The scene wavered like heat shimmer, reality reasserting itself in fragments. The medical equipment faded first, then the changed light, then my aunt herself, leaving only my normal bedroom with its normal furniture and normal shadows. But the figure in black remained. She stood watching me for a long moment, and I had the distinct impression she was weighing something, making some kind of decision about what I'd seen and how I'd reacted. Then, slowly, she began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then nothing at all. The temperature returned to normal. The lights stopped flickering. The silence gave way to the familiar sounds of my building at night. Pipes settling, neighbors moving around, the distant hum of traffic. I stood alone in my bedroom, staring at the spot where my aunt had lain, trying to process what had just happened. Real or imagined, supernatural or psychological break, it felt more authentic than anything I'd experienced in years. The message was clear. Margaret Sinclair was alone in a hospital bed 3,000 miles away, and she needed family. I booked a flight to Scotland that left the next morning. But as I packed, moving through my apartment one last time before leaving for the airport, I found something that made me question everything I thought I understood about the night's events. On my pillow, in exactly the same spot where I'd found the first one, lay another hair. Silver white, impossibly long, smelling of lavender and thyme, and beside it, pressed into the fabric like a watermark, was the faint impression of a head, as if someone had been lying there, sleeping peacefully, while I sat vigil in my living room. I sealed this second hair in another bag and tucked both of them into my carry-on luggage. Evidence of what? I wasn't sure. Proof of visitation or symptoms of breakdown. Either way, they were coming with me to Scotland. The flight was turbulent, matching my mental state perfectly. I dozed fitfully in the cramped airline seat, and my dreams were filled with whispers in languages I didn't recognize, and the rustling of fabric that might have been veils, or might have been wings. When I woke, the passenger beside me was staring at me with concern, asking if I was all right, mentioning that I'd been talking in my sleep. What did I say? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She shrugged, looking uncomfortable. Something about being watched. And you kept saying a name. Margaret, I think. The hospital in Inverness was exactly as sterile and oppressive as hospitals everywhere, but with an added weight of age that made every corridor feel haunted. I found my aunt's room without difficulty, following signs in English and Gaelic through halls that smelled of disinfectant and despair. She looked exactly as she had in my vision, pale, unconscious, breathing with the help of machines. Her white hair spread across the pillow like spun moonlight, and the resemblance to the strands I'd found was unmistakable. I sat beside her bed and told her I was there, that she wasn't alone, though the doctors offered little hope of her hearing me. But when I opened the bag containing the hairs I'd collected, something remarkable happened. The moment the plastic seal broke, my aunt's eyes fluttered open. Not fully conscious, but aware somehow, her gaze finding mine with startling clarity. Her lips moved, forming words too faint to hear, but I leaned close and caught the whisper of sound. "You came," she breathed. "I knew you would come." The nurses called it impossible. Stroke victims at her stage of damage don't simply wake up, don't show that level of awareness. But she continued to improve, hour by hour, as if my presence was somehow anchoring her to consciousness. The doctors spoke of miracles and unexplained recoveries, while I sat by her bedside and wondered what force had reached across an ocean to bring us together. She never fully recovered. Strokes leave their mark. But she lived. For 3 more years, she lived in a care facility where I visited whenever I could, where she told me stories about our family that I'd never heard before. Stories about women who could sense trouble before it arrived, about connections that transcended distance and death, about the thin places where different realities touched. I kept the hairs in a small box on my dresser, and sometimes, on nights when the wind was strong and the city felt particularly lonely, I would catch the faintest hint of lavender in my apartment. Not frightening now, but comforting. A reminder that some bonds exist beyond the physical world, that love and concern can manifest in ways that science hasn't yet learned to measure. When Margaret finally passed, peacefully in her sleep on a winter morning in Scotland, I was sitting in my Chicago apartment, 3,000 miles away. I woke from a dream of standing in a hospital room, watching a figure in black gently touch an old woman's forehead one last time, before turning and walking away into light too bright to follow. The box where I kept the hairs was empty when I checked it that morning. Both strands had vanished, leaving behind only the faintest trace of perfume and the memory of a night when reality proved more flexible than I'd ever imagined. I still don't know if what I experienced was supernatural visitation or psychological phenomenon. Maybe there's no difference. Maybe the mind's ability to create meaning from coincidence is itself a kind of magic. What I do know is that when someone you love needs you, distance becomes meaningless, and the impossible transforms into just another word for what we don't yet understand. The figure in black never returned to my dreams, but sometimes, when I'm helping others through difficult times, I feel her presence like a blessing, a reminder that we're never truly alone, that love finds a way to cross any divide, even the one between sleep and waking, between here and there, between the living and the places they go when our world can no longer hold them. And late at night, when the wind carries just the right combination of scents through my window, I sometimes catch a whisper of lavender and know that somewhere, in the space between breaths, between heartbeats, between one moment and the next, my aunt is still watching over the people she loves, still ensuring that no one faces their darkest hours alone. Story 11. The invitation had arrived at the worst possible time. Sarah's text message glowed on my phone screen like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Stay as long as you need. The house is empty anyway. 3 days after my landlord's eviction notice, her offer felt like divine intervention. I should have recognized it as something else entirely. Sarah's Victorian house squatted on Maple Street like a guilty secret, its weathered shingles the color of old blood under the October sky. The wraparound porch sagged slightly, as if the weight of decades had pressed down upon its bones until something fundamental had shifted. Paint peeled from the window frames in long, deliberate strips, revealing the raw wood beneath like exposed nerve endings. Inside, the hardwood floors gleamed with fresh polyurethane, their surface so perfect they seemed to ripple under the overhead lights. Sarah met me at the door with her characteristic nervous energy, fingers constantly adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses, tucking strands of auburn hair behind her ears, in a gesture I remembered from college. She explained she'd been refinishing the floors room by room, a project that had consumed her weekends for months. The sharp tang of wood stain hung in the air, mixing with something else, something older and mustier that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. We stood in the foyer as she pointed out the guest room upstairs, her voice echoing strangely in the space between the high ceilings and polished floors. That first night passed without incident, though sleep came fitfully. The house settled around me with groans and whispers, each sound amplified by the hardwood surfaces that reflected every creak back upon itself. I attributed my restlessness to the unfamiliar environment, to stress, to the way old houses breathe differently than modern apartments. It was the second night when everything changed. I had been lying awake, listening to the October wind rattle the ancient window frames, when movement in the hallway caught my peripheral vision. Through the crack beneath my door, a shadow passed. Not the quick, purposeful stride of someone heading to the bathroom, but something low and deliberate. The shadow moved with an unsettling fluidity, as if whatever cast it was crawling along the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slipped from beneath the covers, bare feet silent on the cool hardwood. The house felt different at night, as though some fundamental shift occurred after dark. The familiar became alien. The safe became threatening. I eased my door open just wide enough to peer into the hallway, The corridor stretched before me, illuminated by the pale glow of streetlight filtering through the window at its far end. The shadows pooled and shifted, creating patterns that seemed to move independent of their sources. I watched for several minutes, my breath forming small clouds in the surprisingly cold air. Then I saw it. A shape moved along the baseboard, keeping low to the ground. Not quite human in its proportions, it seemed to flow rather than crawl, its edges indistinct against the darkness. It moved with purpose, heading towards Sarah's room at the end of the hall. Something about its movement struck me as profoundly wrong, as if the laws governing normal motion didn't quite apply. I was about to call out, to ask Sarah if she was awake, when her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Rebecca, get out." The words rang with such authority, such desperate command, that they seemed to physically push against the darkness. The shadow thing stopped instantly, as if struck. For a moment that stretched into eternity, it remained motionless. Then, with a speed that defied comprehension, it retreated, flowing backward along the wall like spilled ink running uphill. The sound that followed would haunt me for the rest of my stay. Sarah's bedroom door slammed with such violence that the entire house shuddered. But it wasn't just the sound of wood meeting wood. It was accompanied by a terrible scratching, as if claws were raking across the surface of the door. The noise continued for several seconds, a frenzied scraping that spoke of rage and frustration. Then silence returned, heavy and expectant. I stood frozen in my doorway, every instinct screaming contradictory commands. Part of me wanted to run to Sarah, to make sure she was safe. Another part warned against moving at all, as if motion itself might draw unwanted attention. The rational corner of my mind tried to process what I'd witnessed, offering explanations that felt increasingly hollow even as they formed. Minutes passed before I found the courage to move. I crept down the hallway, my footsteps unnaturally loud despite my efforts at stealth. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. When I reached Sarah's door, I stopped. The surface was gouged with deep scratches, the marks fresh and raw against the refinished wood. 4 parallel lines scored the door from top to bottom, as if massive claws had raked downward in frustration. Wood shavings lay scattered on the floor like sawdust, pale against the dark hardwood. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sound from within. Sarah's breathing came slow and steady, the rhythm of deep sleep. How she could be sleeping after what had just occurred was beyond my comprehension. The scratches in the door were real, tangible evidence that something had happened, yet she slept as if nothing had disturbed her rest. The next morning brought no answers. Sarah emerged from her room bright and cheerful, commenting on how well she'd slept. When I asked about the noise during the night, she looked genuinely puzzled. Her bedroom door stood unmarked, its surface smooth and unblemished. The scratches I'd seen so clearly were gone, leaving no trace of their existence. I began to question my own perceptions. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations, couldn't it? Stress had been my constant companion for months. Perhaps my mind was finally cracking under the pressure. But the memory felt too vivid, too precise to dismiss as mere imagination. The sound of Sarah's voice commanding Rebecca to leave, the scratching on the door, the wrongness of the shadow's movement. These details possessed a clarity that dreams and hallucinations typically lacked. Over the following days, the house seemed to watch me, not in any overt way that I could point to and declare as evidence of my growing paranoia, but through subtle signs that accumulated like pressure in my chest. Doors that I'd left open would be closed when I returned to a room. Objects appeared in different positions, shifted just enough to notice, but not enough to be certain they'd moved at all. The refinished floors, so perfect and gleaming, began to show scuff marks that hadn't been there before. Small gouges appeared overnight, as if something with claws had walked across the surface while we slept. Sarah didn't seem to notice these imperfections, or if she did, she gave no sign of concern. I found myself avoiding certain areas of the house, particularly the hallway at night. The space felt charged with potential, as if something waited just beyond the edge of perception. Sleep became increasingly elusive, and when it did come, it brought dreams of shadows and scratching sounds that followed me into waking. Research became my obsession. I spent hours at the local library, poring over historical records and newspaper archives. What I found did nothing to ease my growing unease. The house had a history of unexplained incidents spanning back to its construction in 1892. Previous owners reported strange sounds, moving shadows, and the persistent sense of being watched. 3 families had left suddenly without explanation, abandoning their possessions as if fleeing something unspeakable. Most disturbing was a pattern that emerged from the records. In nearly every account, witnesses mentioned hearing a name called out in moments of crisis. Rebecca. Always Rebecca. The name appeared in police reports, in diary entries left behind by previous owners, in interviews with neighbors who claimed to hear shouting from the house at all hours. Who was Rebecca? The records provided no clear answer. No one by that name had ever lived in the house, at least not according to official documentation. Yet her presence permeated its history like a stain that couldn't be removed. I confronted Sarah about my findings, expecting skepticism or rational explanations. Instead, her face went pale, and she admitted she'd been experiencing strange incidents since beginning the floor refinishing project. Objects moving on their own, voices in empty rooms, and always the sense that someone else shared the house with her. She'd started sleeping with her bedroom door locked after finding scratches on it one morning, scratches that disappeared when she showed them to a friend later that same day. The name Rebecca had been whispered in her ear one night as she worked late, sanding the hallway floors. When she turned around, no one was there. We compared our experiences, finding disturbing parallels. Both of us had seen the shadow moving through the hallway. Both had heard Sarah's voice commanding Rebecca to leave, though Sarah insisted she'd been asleep when it happened. The scratches on her door appeared and disappeared according to some logic we couldn't fathom. The revelation should have brought relief. Shared delusion was still preferable to individual madness. Instead, it intensified my unease. If we were both experiencing the same phenomena, did that make them more real or less? Was there safety in numbers, or had we both fallen victim to something that fed on belief itself? As my stay extended into its second week, the incidents escalated. The shadow in the hallway became bolder, appearing even during daylight hours. It moved with increasing confidence, no longer retreating when observed. Sometimes it seemed to pause and regard us, though it possessed no discernible features that would allow for such an assessment. The scratches on Sarah's door appeared nightly now, despite her attempts to document them with photographs. The images never captured the damage, showing only smooth, unmarked wood. Yet we could both see the gouges clearly with our naked eyes, fresh and raw as open wounds. Sarah began researching the history of the name Rebecca in connection with the house. She discovered references in local folklore to a woman who had died in a fire that had once threatened the neighborhood. The woman had supposedly died trying to warn others of the danger, her voice carrying across the streets even as flames consumed her. Her name, according to the stories, was Rebecca. But these were just stories, fragments of oral history with no verifiable basis. The fire had happened, certainly. Newspaper accounts confirmed that much. But the identity of the woman who had died remained a mystery, lost to time and the peculiar way tragedies become legends. We decided to try communicating with whatever presence shared the house. Using a digital recorder, we sat in the hallway one night and spoke into the darkness, asking questions and waiting for responses. The recordings captured our voices clearly, but nothing else, except for a sound that might have been breathing, or wind, or the house settling around us. Yet during the session itself, we both heard something else. Whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, too quiet to understand but unmistakably present. The shadows shifted and moved in ways that couldn't be explained by our small flashlight. And when we asked directly who Rebecca was, the temperature in the hallway dropped noticeably, our breath suddenly visible in the cold air. The session ended abruptly when Sarah's bedroom door began to rattle in its frame, shaking so violently that we feared it might splinter. We retreated to our respective rooms, doors locked, listening to the sounds that echoed through the house until dawn. I should have left then. Every rational instinct urged me to pack my belongings and find shelter elsewhere. But something held me in place. Curiosity, perhaps, or a perverse need to understand what was happening. The incidents had become so woven into the fabric of my days that the thought of returning to normal life felt impossible. How could I sit in an office cubicle and pretend that shadows couldn't move independently, that names couldn't echo through empty houses, that doors couldn't bear wounds that healed themselves? The answer came on my final night, though it raised more questions than it resolved. I had been lying awake, listening to the familiar symphony of settling wood and wind-rattled windows, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the flowing movement of the shadow thing, but the deliberate steps of someone walking. The sound was so normal, so human, that I almost called out in greeting. Then I remembered that Sarah had left that afternoon to visit her sister in the next town, not planning to return until morning. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Through the crack beneath it, I could see a shadow, but this time it was clearly human in proportion, standing upright as if someone waited in the hallway. My heart hammered as I approached the door, pressing my ear against its surface. Breathing, slow, measured, definitely human. Whoever stood outside seemed to be listening as intently as I was. I don't know what possessed me to speak. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of days spent questioning my sanity, or the desperate need for resolution. But I found myself whispering into the silence. "Rebecca?" The breathing stopped. For a moment, the house held its breath with whatever presence lurked beyond my door. Then, in a voice that was unmistakably Sarah's, yet somehow wrong in its cadence and tone, came the response. "She's not here anymore." Panic flooded my system as I understood the impossibility of what I'd heard. Sarah was 50 miles away, staying overnight with family. The voice was hers, but it carried an inflection I'd never heard before. Older, wearier, tinged with a sadness that seemed to echo through decades. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, though my throat felt constricted. "The one who stays," came the reply. "The one who watches. The one who remembers when Rebecca was here." The conversation that followed defied everything I thought I knew about reality. The presence in the hallway spoke in Sarah's voice, but claimed to be someone else entirely. Someone who had lived in the house for decades, watching as families came and went, as the floors were refinished and the rooms rearranged. She spoke of Rebecca as if the name belonged to someone who had once shared the house, but had since departed, leaving only echoes behind. According to this presence, the scratches on the door were messages, attempts to communicate that Rebecca no longer answered when called. The shadow in the hallway was searching, looking for someone who couldn't be found. And the voice that commanded Rebecca to leave was trying to protect her from something that had already happened long ago. The explanation made no sense, yet it possessed an internal logic that my exhausted mind couldn't quite reject. Time seemed fluid in the house, past and present blending like watercolors in rain. What I'd interpreted as supernatural activity might be something else entirely. Echoes of events that had played out before, residual energy trapped in wood and stone and the very air itself. As dawn approached, the presence retreated, footsteps fading down the hallway like a recording played in reverse. I never heard the voice again, though I remained in the house for several more hours, packing my belongings and trying to process what had occurred. Sarah returned that morning to find me waiting on the front porch, my bags at my feet. She looked exhausted, as if she too had spent a sleepless night, though she claimed her sister's house had been perfectly quiet. I told her I needed to move on, find a more permanent living situation. I didn't mention the conversation in the hallway, the voice that had sounded like hers but belonged to someone else. Some experiences resist translation into words, and I suspected this was one of them. As I loaded my car, I noticed fresh scratches on Sarah's bedroom door, 4 parallel lines scored deep into the wood. When I pointed them out, she looked genuinely puzzled, claiming she couldn't see any damage at all. I drove away that morning without looking back, though the house seemed to watch my departure through its empty windows. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement in the upstairs hallway, a shadow passing by the window, searching for something that would never be found. Months have passed since my stay on Maple Street, but the experience follows me like a persistent echo. I find myself listening for voices in empty rooms, watching for shadows that move independently of their sources. Sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, I hear that voice again, Sarah's voice but not Sarah's voice, whispering about the one who stays and the one who remembers. I've researched the house obsessively, searching for some rational explanation for what occurred. The historical records remain maddeningly vague, offering hints but no concrete answers. Rebecca remains a ghost in the archives, a name without a face, a presence without a past. But I've found other things in my research, recent things that chill me more than any historical mystery. Property records show that Sarah sold the house 3 weeks after my departure, accepting an offer well below market value from a buyer who insisted on a rapid closing. The listing described it as a perfect family home with recently refinished hardwood floors. The most disturbing discovery came through social media, where I maintain a casual friendship with Sarah, despite the strangeness of my departure. Her recent posts show her settled in a small apartment across town, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. But in one photo, a casual selfie taken in her new living room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Behind her, barely visible in the reflection of a mirror on the far wall, was a shadow that didn't correspond to anyone in the room. It was indistinct, but unmistakably present, standing just beyond the edge of clear visibility. Sarah looks happy in her photos, healthy and content. But I wonder if she knows she wasn't the only one who left that house on Maple Street. I wonder if she's noticed the small sounds that might follow her, the sense of being watched, the way shadows sometimes move without explanation. And I wonder, with a fear that has settled into my bones like winter cold, whether the presence that spoke to me in Sarah's voice that final night was telling the truth when it claimed to be the one who stays. Because if it was, then what exactly did leave the house that morning? And more importantly, where did it go? I've never tried to contact Sarah about my suspicions. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, and some questions are better left unasked. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and shadows pool in the corners of my apartment, I find myself whispering into the darkness, "Rebecca?" And in the silence that follows, I listen for footsteps that sound too familiar, for breathing that doesn't belong to me, for a voice that might answer in words I don't want to hear. The house on Maple Street has new owners now, a young couple with dreams of restoration and renovation. I've driven past it twice, telling myself I was simply in the neighborhood, though I live on the other side of town. The floors gleam through the windows, perfect and unmarked. The porch no longer sags, and fresh paint covers the window frames in cheerful colors. It looks like a normal house again, the kind of place where normal families build normal lives. But I know better now. I know that some things can't be refinished away, can't be painted over or sanded smooth. Some echoes are too deep, too persistent to silence, and sometimes when the October wind rattles my windows and the world feels thin between one moment and the next, I remember the weight of that presence in the hallway, the wrongness of hearing Sarah's voice speak words that weren't hers. I remember, and I listen for my name in the darkness, hoping I'll never hear it called by a voice that sounds like my own. Because if I do, I'll know that the one who stays has found someone new to remember, and that Rebecca, whoever she really was, has been replaced by someone else entirely. Someone who answers when their name is called in the dark. Story 12. The lock clicks with finality as I barricade myself in the only room with a door that still closes properly. My hands shake against the cold brass handle, and I press my ear to the painted wood, listening for sounds that shouldn't exist in an empty apartment. The bathroom tiles feel like ice beneath my bare feet, each step sending shivers up my spine that have nothing to do with the temperature. Through the narrow gap at the bottom of the door, 4 golden eyes stare back at me. Whiskers and Midnight, my 2 cats, sit perfectly still in the hallway, their unblinking gaze fixed on my hiding place. They never sit like that, so rigid, so focused. Usually they'd be pawing at the door, demanding attention or access to their favorite perch on the toilet seat. Instead, they remain motionless sentinels, as if guarding against something I cannot see. The front door groans open without its familiar screech. I installed that door myself 6 months ago, fighting with warped wood and stubborn hinges, until every opening produced a prolonged metallic protest. The landlord had promised to fix it, but like everything else in this building, promises dissolved into bureaucratic vapor. I'd grown accustomed to the warning it provided. No one could enter without announcing themselves through that torturous squeal. But now it opens silently, smoothly, as if floating on invisible hinges. A prolonged sigh drifts through the apartment, a sound like autumn wind through dead leaves. It carries weight, exhaustion, and something else. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. The exhalation seems to fill every corner of my small living space, seeping under the bathroom door and wrapping around my ankles like cold fingers. Yet when I peer through the crack, the hallway remains empty. The cats haven't moved. They continue their vigil, occasionally twitching an ear or shifting weight from one paw to another, but their eyes never leave the door. Their behavior reminds me of the nature documentaries where prey animals freeze when predators approach. Every muscle tense, every sense alert to danger that hovers just beyond perception. My breath fogs the mirror above the sink as I lean against it, searching for rational explanations. The building is old, settling constantly. Pipes expand and contract with temperature changes. Windows don't seal properly, allowing drafts to create atmospheric pressure differences that could cause doors to open. The cats are simply reacting to my own anxiety, feeding off the nervous energy I've been radiating for weeks. But explanations crumble when I remember that I locked the front door. 3 separate locks, deadbolt, chain, and the twist lock in the handle. I checked them twice before settling in for the evening, part of the ritual that had developed over the past month. The ritual that began when I started feeling watched. It started subtly, as these things always do. A sensation of eyes on my back while washing dishes. The feeling that someone had just left a room when I entered it. Shadows in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look directly. I attributed it to stress from the new job, the recent move, the adjustment to living alone for the first time in years. Then came the sounds. Footsteps in the apartment above, despite knowing the unit had been vacant for 3 months. Whispers in the walls that could have been pipes or wind, but carried cadences too rhythmic, too conversational to be entirely natural. The elevator stopping at my floor in the dead of night, doors opening and closing without anyone emerging. I'd begun keeping a journal, documenting each incident with the methodical precision of a scientist cataloging phenomena. Time, duration, atmospheric conditions, my emotional state, everything that might explain the inexplicable. The entries filled a notebook with cramped handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as days passed. Tuesday, 2:15 a.m. Heard someone walking in kitchen. Cats alert, but not alarmed. Checked. Nothing disturbed. Temperature dropped 8 degrees in living room. Friday, 6:30 p.m. Distinct feeling of being watched while showering. Steam on mirror showed handprint that wasn't mine. Too large, fingers too long. Wiped it away immediately. Sunday, 11:45 p.m. Whispers in bedroom wall. Lasted 12 minutes. Sounded like conversation but couldn't make out words. Cats sleeping peacefully throughout. The journal entries became a lifeline to sanity, proof that events were occurring outside my imagination. But reading them now, in the clinical fluorescent light of the bathroom, they seemed like the ravings of someone losing their grip on reality. Another sigh echoes through the apartment, closer this time. I press my eye to the gap beneath the door, scanning what little I can see of the hallway. The cats remain in position, but something has changed in their posture. Whisker's tail twitches once, a sharp motion that sends shadows dancing across the thin strip of visible floor. Midnight's ears rotate like radar dishes, tracking something I cannot perceive. The temperature in the bathroom drops precipitously. My breath becomes visible in sharp puffs, and frost begins forming on the edges of the mirror. The sudden cold bites through my thin t-shirt and shorts, raising goosebumps along my arms and legs. I reach for the heater switch, but the mechanical click produces no warmth, no fan noise. nothing but the hollow echo of a system that refuses to respond. Through the crack, I watch a shadow pass across the hallway floor. It moves wrong, too fluid, lacking the sharp edges that light sources create. The shadow seems to flow rather than fall, pooling and spreading like liquid darkness before reforming into a vaguely human silhouette. The cats track its movement with minute head adjustments, but show no sign of fear or curiosity. They simply observe, as if this shadow thing is a regular visitor they've learned to tolerate. My phone sits on the kitchen counter, charging and useless. The bathroom has no window, no secondary exit, no way to call for help or escape if the shadow decides to investigate the source of my rapid breathing. I realize that I've trapped myself in the smallest room of the apartment, cornered by my own paranoia and whatever entity has decided to visit. The doorknob turns slowly, testing the lock with deliberate patience. I bite down on my knuckle to stifle a gasp, tasting blood as my teeth break skin. The brass handle rotates clockwise, pauses, then returns to its original position. The motion repeats several times, each attempt more confident than the last, as if whatever controls it is, learning the mechanism through trial and error. The cats never react to the moving handle. They continue their vigil, watching the door as if the real threat exists behind it rather than in the hallway. Their behavior suggests they're protecting something, or someone, from whatever lurks beyond their line of sight. Static electricity builds in the air, making my hair stand on end and creating a metallic taste on my tongue. The bathroom lights flicker in irregular patterns, casting strobing shadows that transform familiar objects into threatening shapes. The toilet becomes a crouching figure. The towel rack stretches into grasping arms. The bathtub yawns like an open mouth waiting to swallow whatever falls into its porcelain maw. Another sigh, this one directly outside the door. The sound carries intimacy, as if exhaled by someone who knows me, who has been waiting patiently for this moment of vulnerability. It reminds me of my ex-girlfriend's sleeping breath, the way she used to sigh contentedly after particularly stressful days. But Sarah moved to Portland 8 months ago, cutting all contact after our relationship dissolved into mutual exhaustion and resentment. The resemblance is impossible, yet undeniable. Through the gap, I see the cats finally move. They stand in unison, arch their backs, and perform the slow-motion dance that precedes either greeting or confrontation. Their tails puff to twice normal size, but their movement lacks the aggression typically associated with territorial displays. Instead, they seem to be performing some sort of ceremony, acknowledging a presence that demands respect rather than challenge. The doorknob stops turning. Silence settles over the apartment like a heavy blanket, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the building's ancient heating system struggling against the supernatural cold. My legs cramp from crouching, and I shift position carefully, trying to minimize the sound of skin against tile. The cats sit back down, resuming their vigil as if nothing has changed. But something fundamental has shifted in the atmosphere. The oppressive weight of being observed has lifted, replaced by a different sensation: emptiness, abandonment, the hollow feeling that follows the departure of company. Whatever visited has gone, leaving behind only questions and the lingering scent of something floral and familiar. I wait another hour before unlocking the door. The hallway is empty, normal, illuminated by the same flickering overhead bulb that has needed replacement since I moved in. The front door stands closed, all 3 locks engaged exactly as I left them. No signs of intrusion, no evidence of supernatural visitation, nothing but 2 cats who greet me with typical feline indifference before wandering toward their food bowls. The journal entry I write later fills 3 pages with detailed descriptions of sounds, temperatures, and sensations that seem increasingly impossible in retrospect. I include sketches of the shadow's movement patterns and transcribe the rhythm of the sighs as musical notation, searching for patterns that might explain the experience through rational analysis. But as I review the pages, doubt creeps in like fog through window cracks. The handwriting looks wrong, too steady for someone experiencing terror, too controlled for genuine panic. The descriptions read like fiction rather than observation, crafted for effect rather than accuracy. Most disturbing of all, I find myself unable to distinguish between what I actually experienced and what I may have constructed from fear and isolation. The cats offer no answers. They sleep peacefully on the couch, occasionally twitching through dreams that might involve mice or shadows, or things that exist in the space between reality and imagination. Their contentment suggests that whatever occurred posed no real threat, that my terror was either misplaced or entirely self-generated. Yet every night since, I found myself returning to the bathroom when darkness falls, locking the door and watching through the gap for golden eyes and impossible shadows. The cats always take their positions, the temperature always drops, and the doorknob always turns with that same patient persistence. And every morning, I wake with the growing certainty that I'm either losing my mind or learning to recognize something that has always been there, waiting just beyond the edge of perception for someone willing to acknowledge its presence. The journal now fills 2 notebooks, but I've stopped reading the entries. Some knowledge carries too much weight for sanity to bear, and some questions are better left unanswered. Instead, I simply observe and record, documenting encounters with something that may exist only in the spaces between my thoughts. The cats continue their vigil, watching the door with patient dedication, and I continue mine, waiting in the cold sanctuary of the bathroom for answers that may never come, accompanied only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional sigh of something that might be wind, might be imagination, or might be something far more complex than either explanation can contain. The lock clicks. The watching begins again. Story 13. On the first time I felt it, I convinced myself it was the house settling. Old pipes, maybe. The weight of 43 years pressing down through floorboards, through ceiling joists, finding its way to my legs like water seeking the lowest point. But pipes don't step carefully around your kneecaps. Pipes don't pause, as if considering their next move. It was 2:17 a.m. when I finally reached for the bedside lamp, my fingers trembling against the switch. The click echoed through the room like a gunshot, and the sudden burst of yellow light revealed nothing but dust motes dancing in the still air. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed except me, and I was holding my breath so hard my chest ached. But there they were, footprints, small as closed fists, pressed into the thin layer of dust that had accumulated on my hardwood floor despite my weekly cleaning. They started at the foot of my bed and traced a careful path along the left side, avoiding the creaky board I knew was there, ending at my pillow where something had apparently stood and watched me sleep. I stared at those prints for 20 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs like something caged and desperate. 5 toes, clearly defined, an arch, the subtle indentation of a heel, but the size was all wrong. Too small for a human foot, too large for a rodent, too precise for anything that should exist in the space between. When I finally worked up the courage to examine them more closely, kneeling beside my bed with a flashlight, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The footprints weren't random. They showed purpose, calculation. The spacing was even, measured, as if whatever made them had been taking great care not to wake me. The final print, closest to my pillow, was deeper than the others, as if the weight had shifted, as if something had leaned in to get a better look. I swept the floor that morning, scrubbed it with bleach until my knees were raw and my hands cracked from the chemicals. I changed my sheets, flipped my mattress, even moved my bed 6 inches closer to the window. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I began to relax, to chalk it up to stress from the divorce, from starting over at 52, from living alone for the first time since college. Then it came back. This time I felt it more distinctly. The careful pressure moving up my calves, pausing at my knees, then continuing along my thighs. The sensation was neither cold nor warm, neither rough nor smooth. It was simply there, undeniably present, like a memory made tangible. I lay perfectly still, eyes closed, trying to control my breathing while whatever it was completed its journey. The pressure stopped at my hip, remained there for what felt like an eternity, then retreated the same careful path it had come. I didn't turn on the light immediately this time. I waited, listening to the silence that seemed to press against my eardrums with its own weight. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Then another. Soft footsteps moving away from my room, down the hallway, toward the living room where they faded into nothing. When I finally illuminated the room, the footprints were there again. But this time they were different, deeper, more numerous. They circled my bed like a ritual dance, overlapping in places, as if whatever made them had been pacing, thinking, planning. And there, pressed into the dust beside my pillow, was the clear impression of a small hand. I didn't sleep for the next 2 days. I called in sick to work, spent my time researching online, trying to find some rational explanation. Carbon monoxide poisoning could cause hallucinations, but my detector showed normal levels. Sleep paralysis could create the sensation of pressure, but I was fully awake, fully mobile. Mice could leave tracks, but not like these. Nothing could explain the deliberate, intelligent pattern of the marks. By the third night, exhaustion overwhelmed fear. I collapsed into bed still wearing my clothes, too tired to care about whatever might visit me in the dark. I must have slept deeply because I didn't feel the pressure this time, didn't stir until morning light crept through my curtains and painted the room in shades of amber and gold. The footprints had multiplied. They covered every inch of my floor now, layered so thick in places that individual prints were impossible to distinguish. They climbed the walls, somehow impossibly. Small, dusty impressions ascending the vertical surface like gravity had simply ceased to matter. They traced the perimeter of my ceiling, congregated around the light fixture, then descended the opposite wall in a perfect spiral. But it was the mirror that made me finally understand I was losing my mind. Small handprints covered its surface, pressed from the inside, as if tiny fingers had been pushing against the glass from within the reflection itself. And there, written in the dust that had somehow accumulated on the mirror's surface overnight, were words in a child's unsteady script. "Why did you leave us?" I backed away from the mirror so fast I stumbled, caught myself against the dresser, and knocked over a picture frame. The glass shattered, and in the sudden sharp sound I heard something else. A giggle, soft and distant, coming from somewhere behind the walls. That's when I remembered Tommy Morrison. The thought hit me like a physical blow, and I had to sit down on the edge of my bed to steady myself. Tommy Morrison, 8 years old, who had lived in this house 40 years ago when my family first moved to the neighborhood. Tommy, who had been my best friend until the day his parents packed up and left without warning, without explanation, without even saying goodbye. I had forgotten about Tommy, buried the memory so deep that it had taken 40 years and a collection of impossible footprints to dig it back up. But now it all came flooding back. The games we'd played, the secrets we'd shared, the promise we'd made that we'd always be friends no matter what. The giggling came again, closer now, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it was coming from under my bed. I dropped to my hands and knees, pressed my cheek against the cold hardwood, and peered into the shadows beneath the box spring. 2 small eyes stared back at me, reflecting the morning light like a cat's, but rounder, more human. They blinked once, slowly, then vanished. "Tommy?" I whispered to the empty space, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. The house answered with silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Expectant, listening, alive with possibility. I stayed there on my hands and knees for a long time, staring into the darkness under my bed, waiting for those eyes to return. They never did. But that night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I felt the familiar pressure begin again at my feet. This time, though, it felt different. Lighter, more hesitant, as if whatever was touching me was afraid I might disappear the way it had disappeared, all those years ago. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't move. I just lay there and let the small presence walk its careful path along my legs, over my torso, until it settled next to my pillow like it belonged there. And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress and loneliness had finally cracked something fundamental in my brain, and I was manufacturing comfort from childhood memories and guilt. Maybe the footprints were just dust patterns I was interpreting incorrectly, the pressure just blood circulation problems, the giggling just the house settling in ways that sounded familiar. Or maybe Tommy Morrison had been waiting 40 years for me to come back, to keep the promise I'd forgotten I'd made, to remember the friend I'd left behind without meaning to. In the morning, there were no footprints on the floor. The mirror was clean. The silence was just silence, empty and ordinary. But on my nightstand, next to the lamp I hadn't turned on, sat a small origami crane made from yellowed paper, the kind of craft project they used to teach in elementary school, the kind Tommy and I had made dozens of together during those long summer afternoons before his family moved away. I picked up the crane with shaking fingers, unfolded it carefully, and found a message written inside in faded pencil. "Thanks for staying this time." I never saw the footprints again, never felt the pressure, never heard the giggling. But sometimes, late at night when sleep eludes me, I leave a small origami bird on my nightstand before turning off the light. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's gone in the morning. Whether that's madness or mercy, I no longer care to know.